They say an alpha never breaks. But nobody warns you what happens when the one person who saw through the armor heard the truth you never meant to say out loud. King Sevran Thorne built an empire on iron will and cold calculation. He conquered every rival, every storm, every battlefield that dared test him. Then one woman walked away in the rain without a single word and brought the whole damn throne to its knees. Stay until the end. You will not see this resolution coming. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from right now. This story belongs to all of us. The marble corridor was cold enough to taste. Lady Aveline Drax had learned years ago that palaces were never truly warm, not in the ways that mattered. The fires burned high and the tapestries kept out drafts. But the cold that lived inside Velmora's walls came from something no flame could reach. It came from the people who moved through them, the ministers with their sealed faces, the guards who watched without seeing, the king's advisors who smiled with their mouths while their eyes counted every weakness they could eventually use. She had learned to move through that cold like it was weather. Tonight, she moved fast. The royal celebration in the East Wing had spilled music into every corridor, and that music made the silence in the council wing feel more total by comparison. The way a candle makes surrounding darkness feel heavier. Aveline carried 3 sealed decrees pressed against her chest, her fingers curved around them with a grip that looked casual and wasn't. Sevran had summoned her personally, not through a courier, not through his chamberlain. He had come to her rooms an hour before, and the memory of him still sat behind her sternum like a swallowed coal. He had adjusted the silver fastening at her wrist. His touch was careful, deliberate. The kind of touch a man uses when he wants a woman to feel chosen rather than managed, and she had let herself believe just for a moment that the distinction still held. He had kissed her forehead. "Go to bed," he'd said. "Don't wait up." She had almost believed him. That was the part she wouldn't forgive herself for. Not tonight, maybe not for years. She had almost believed him. But she'd forgotten her second seal ring on the council table earlier that afternoon, the one she used for secondary correspondence, and so she had turned back. Simple as that. No instinct, no premonition, just a woman retracing steps for a ring she couldn't afford to lose. And then she heard the laughter. It didn't come through a crack in the door. The council chamber doors were thick carved oak that had absorbed 100 years of political violence and come out looking dignified for it. But Velmora's architects had never anticipated a woman who moved in absolute silence, who had learned stillness as a survival skill long before she learned how to read court language. Aveline stood 3 feet from those doors and heard the voices as clearly as if she were seated at the table herself. She recognized Councillor Drevin first. He had a laugh like gravel rolling in a tin bucket, distinctive and self-satisfied. Then Minister Holst, whose voice always carried even when he thought he was being subtle. And then Sevran. His voice was the one she knew best. She had cataloged every register of it. The public authority voice, the private quiet voice, the strategic voice he used in negotiation when he wanted his opponent to feel heard while he was actually reading their vulnerabilities. She knew the voice he used when he was relaxed among men he trusted. She knew it the way you know the sound of a house settling at night. He was using that voice now. She heard her own name. She stopped breathing. "Aveline manages the Eastern correspondence without complaint," Sevran said. "She's thorough, discreet. She makes the other council wives nervous, which keeps them occupied." More laughter. Drevin's gravel in tin, Holst's baritone rumble. "Does she know?" someone asked, and Aveline didn't recognize this voice, which meant it was a man even Sevran trusted above the usual circle, someone whose presence required discretion. "Know what?" Sevran's voice carried amusement. "That she's handling correspondence you don't want touching your formal council record." A pause. "She knows what I tell her." His voice settled into something smoother. "She's loyal, useful, easy to keep close." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. That was the thing Aveline would carry with her for the rest of her life, because cruelty she could have metabolized. Cruelty had an edge. Cruelty at least acknowledged that the person being wounded was worth the effort of contempt. This was different. This was comfortable laughter. The laughter of men who had forgotten she was a person rather than a fixture of the room. The way people laugh about furniture arrangements or seasonal hunting plans. This was laughter that arrived in a place so far past cruelty that it circled around to something worse. It was the laughter of men who had stopped considering whether she might hear them, because why would she? She was loyal, useful, easy to keep close. Aveline stood in the corridor for 7 full seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Her body had apparently decided to keep records while her mind was busy discovering what a cathedral feels like when its foundation drops 3 inches. She did not cry. She stepped backward. The marble received her footfalls without a sound, and she pulled the corridor's shadow around herself the way she might pull a coat, and she disappeared from the doorway with the decrees still pressed against her chest and her face perfectly still. When Sevran emerged from the council chamber less than 10 minutes later, the corridor was empty. He looked both ways. His expression shifted through something she would have recognized as relief, followed immediately by that particular tension that lives in powerful men's shoulders when the world does not arrange itself as expected. He was expecting to find her waiting, either to give her a gentle dismissal for lingering or to walk her back through the palace with the proprietary ease of a man whose arrangements are exactly where he left them. There was nothing, only torchlight and the distant sound of celebration. He went to her rooms. She was already in her bed, or appeared to be, lying absolutely still in the dark with her back to the door, and her breathing controlled with the discipline of a woman who had spent years learning to perform rest when rest was the last thing available to her. She heard him stand in the doorway for almost a full minute. Then he left. And Aveline lay in the dark with her eyes open, staring at the wall while the empire rearranged itself around the new and permanent architecture of what she now understood. She did not sleep. She planned. By the second hour before dawn, she was already packing. Not frantically. That would have been a luxury she couldn't afford, because panic makes noise and leaves evidence, and above all else, panic is visible in ways that composure is not. She moved through her rooms with the surgical economy of a woman who had grown up understanding that the difference between surviving and not surviving is usually the difference between clear thinking and feeling. She left the jewels, every single piece, the emerald collar Sevran had given her after the winter campaign, the diamond eardrops from the trade delegation, the gold and sapphire bracelet she had worn for 3 years because he had personally clasped it at her wrist and watched her face when she saw it, and the memory of that moment had made her wear it longer than she'd intended to. She left the ceremonial gowns. She left the iron crown pendant he had placed around her throat during winter court 2 years ago with a formality that had felt like promise and now felt like cataloging. She took practical things, the clothes that would survive weather and movement, her cipher books, a leather case of secondary seals she was legally entitled to, because she had always been smart enough to understand the difference between what was formally hers and what she was merely borrowing from proximity to power. 200 in silver coins she had accumulated over 4 years from her own account, which she had maintained separately from the moment she arrived in Velmora, because she had not survived childhood in a minor border house by assuming permanence. She wrote nothing. No letter, no accusation, no artful final line designed to make him understand what he'd destroyed. Those were performances for women who still needed the person leaving to feel the weight of the departure. Aveline was done needing Sevran Thorne to understand anything. She was, as it turned out, done needing him at all. She moved through the servants' corridor before the palace kitchen fires were lit, carrying one bag across her shoulder, and walked out through the old garrison gate that had been sealed for 8 years and therefore appeared in no guard rotation. She had identified that gate 11 months ago. She had never told anyone. That was the kind of thinking that had kept her breathing through situations most people didn't survive. The rain hit her before she'd crossed 20 feet of open ground, and it hit hard. The kind of cold northern downpour that falls in sheets rather than drops and saturates everything within minutes. She pulled her collar up and walked into it without changing her pace, because discomfort was just weather, and weather was just condition, and conditions were things you moved through rather than things you stopped for. She was 2 miles outside the capital's eastern gate before the palace bells rang false dawn. By the time Sevran's guards discovered her rooms empty, she had 4 miles on them and a route through the lower market district that would make tracking her through mud and market refuse functionally impossible for anyone following on horseback. Inside the palace, the discovery moved fast. The chamberlain reached Sevran's private advisor before sunrise. The advisor woke Sevran with a face that said he would rather have swallowed his own tongue than delivered this particular piece of information. Sevran sat up in bed. His advisor told him, There was a silence in that room that the advisor would describe later, privately, to exactly no one, as the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed from a man who had ordered 3 executions without raising his voice. "How long?" Sevran's voice was flat. "We believe she left before the 3rd watch change." "That's 3 hours." "Yes, Majesty." Sevran stood. He dressed himself, which he almost never did, because habit belonged to the rhythms of normal days, and this was not a normal day. "Send riders east and south, not the full cavalry, 4 men each direction, quietly. And if the council asks why you're... The council can ask questions when I'm ready to answer them." His voice had the quality of a blade right before it's used. Not threatening, simply ready. "Get me my horse." The advisor left at a speed that suggested his legs had made decisions without consulting the rest of him. Sevran stood at the window of his chamber and watched rain fall on the capital city of an empire that stretched through 6 mountain territories and 3 major trade corridors, chores, and controlled the flow of iron, grain, and military passage across the entire northern range. He felt none of it. He was thinking about a woman walking through pre-dawn rain with 1 bag, and the expression she had not been wearing when he had stood in her doorway the night before, because the expression she had been wearing, which he had taken for sleep, had been something he now recognized with the particular cold clarity of a man whose professional life consisted of reading situations accurately and who had therefore just discovered the cost of applying that skill too late. She had been awake. She had been still because she had chosen to be still. And the choice behind that stillness was something Sevran Thorne, king of Velmora, alpha ruler of 6 mountain kingdoms, was going to have to look at directly, whether he wanted to or not. He pulled on his riding coat. The storm outside didn't concern him. He'd ridden through worse. What concerned him was the particular quality of her absence, which was not like a person who had left in anger. Anger left traces. Anger overturned furniture or slammed gates, or left a note with lines scored so hard into the parchment the words were felt as much as read. Anger was negotiable because anger still needed a response. This absence was clean. That was what kept working on him as he rode south with 4 guards behind him, and rain turning the road to mud, and the capital disappearing at his back. Not the fact of her leaving. He had managed defections before, and he could manage this. Not the political inconvenience, which was real but containable. What kept working on him, persistent and uncomfortable as a stone in a boot, was the cleanliness of it. She had packed nothing that wasn't hers. She had left nothing he could read as a message. She had simply removed herself from the arrangements of his life with the same surgical efficiency she had brought to every other task he'd ever given her. And the recognition of that, the recognition that she had applied to her own departure the same quality of mind he had valued in her service, was something he couldn't quite manage. He rode harder. 2 miles east of the Narrows, where the road climbed toward the abandoned outpost that military planners had stopped thinking about after the border reorganization 3 years ago, his lead rider raised a hand. Tracks. Moving east. Recent. Sevran felt the tight knot in his chest release slightly, which surprised him because he hadn't known it was there. She was alive. She hadn't been taken. The various worst possibilities his tactical mind had been quietly cataloging since he got on the horse retreated to wherever worst possibilities lived when they're no longer needed. What replaced them was not simpler. The outpost appeared through rain and mist as a collection of broken shapes, half-walls, and collapsed timber, and one structure that still had most of its roof. It was the kind of place that appears on military maps with the notation formerly functional, and gets used occasionally by travelers who understand that the difference between a partially ruined shelter and no shelter at all is the difference between wet and dying. The firelight inside was faint enough that it wasn't visible until they were close. Sevran signaled his riders to hold. He dismounted and approached the outpost on foot, because whatever was about to happen was not something he wanted mediated by the presence of 4 guards who would remember every word and report it to at least 3 different parties within the week. He stopped in the broken doorway. Aveline sat on a low stone with her back against the wall, and her bag at her feet and her hair dark with rain that had dried unevenly, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her face did something he had not been prepared for. Nothing. Not anger, not guilt, not relief, not the complicated mix of emotion he had been preparing to manage. Her face was still in the way that faces are still when the person wearing them has passed through a storm and come out the other side of it, and found the landscape on this side familiar enough to navigate. She had been expecting him. He stepped inside. The fire was too small for the space, and the shelter smelled of old stone and rain and something else he didn't identify immediately. A sharper smell, recently disturbed, like someone else had been here recently. He looked around. She wasn't alone. The man standing in the far shadow of the structure moved out of it with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had assessed the newcomer and found him interesting but not immediately threatening, which was itself a kind of statement. He was roughly Sevran's height, darker coloring, silver battle leather with the kind of careful wear pattern that came from actual use rather than ceremonial display. He moved like a man who had learned to move that way because at some point the alternative was dying. Sevran knew him. He had never met him in person. But you don't rule 6 mountain territories without knowing the faces and reputations of the men who rule adjacent territory. And this man's face had been on enough intelligence reports that it sat in Sevran's memory with the particular weight of something that had been classified as a long-term problem. King Draven Mirek, Eastern Dominion of Norvac, Sevran's oldest rival. Not in terms of active conflict, they had maintained an aggressive border peace for 4 years through mutual deterrence, but in terms of the particular tension that exists between 2 systems of power that occupy adjacent space and understand each other well enough to know that eventual collision is a matter of timing rather than question. He stood in a broken shelter in the mountains between their territories, with Aveline between them, and the 3 of them occupied the same silence for almost 10 seconds. Then Draven spoke. His voice was lower than expected, not loud. It didn't need to be loud. "You rode fast," he said. Not to Sevran, to the room, as though he was noting weather. Sevran's eyes stayed on Aveline. "What is this?" His voice was controlled. It cost him. She met his gaze without difficulty. "This is me, having left. In the middle of the night. In a storm." He didn't mean it as an accusation. It came out like one anyway. "The storm started after I left." She looked at him the way you look at something you've spent time examining and have finally finished examining and can now simply observe. "I didn't plan the weather, Sevran. I only planned the leaving." He exhaled through his nose. He crossed the space between the doorway and where she sat, stopping far enough from her to leave room for her to stand if she chose to, which was a calculation he made without being aware he was making it, the automatic diplomacy of a man who had learned not to corner things that might still be reachable. "Come home," he said. The 2 words cost him more than he expected. She didn't move. "No." "Aveline." "No." Her voice was not loud. It was not wavering. It had the quality of a decision that has been made so completely that revisiting it is not a concept that carries any weight. Sevran felt something shift behind his sternum. He ignored it. He was good at ignoring things that interfered with clarity. "Whatever you heard." "I heard what you said." She cut across him without raising her voice. "I'm not interested in discussing what I heard, Sevran. I understood it when I heard it. My understanding hasn't changed. Council conversation is, don't." For the first time, something moved in her expression. Not anger, something cleaner than anger. Something that made him stop talking. "Don't tell me what council conversation is. I have sat in enough rooms adjacent to council conversation to understand exactly what it is. Don't tell me I misunderstood the room I was standing in." Silence. Behind him, Draven had not moved. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and his attention complete, the way predators pay attention, not visibly scanning, but missing nothing. Sevran became aware of him with the specific quality of awareness that powerful men have about other powerful men in shared space, the constant low-frequency hum of territorial instinct. He turned his head. "Mirek." He said the name the way you say a title when you're deciding how much respect the situation requires. Draven looked at him without expression. "Thorne. This is not your territory." "No." Draven glanced once at Aveline, then back at Sevran. "She is not your territory either." The sentence landed like a flat stone on still water, spreading rings. Sevran turned back to Aveline. He made a decision. The decision cost him something he didn't have a word for, which was itself a new experience for a man who had spent his life naming things so he could control them. "I need to talk to you," he said, without an audience. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Draven. Something passed between them that Sevran couldn't read, which was infuriating and instructive in equal measure. Draven picked up a leather dispatch bag from the floor near the far wall and walked out through what remained of the rear wall's gap without another word. Sevran waited until his footsteps faded under the rain. Then he crouched down so that he and Aveline were at eye level, because standing over her felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate, and he was running on instinct now rather than strategy, which was unusual enough to notice. "I care about you," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. He said them so rarely in direct form. That was not performance. Whatever you heard, whatever was said in that room tonight, it does not represent what is real. She looked at him steadily. "You said I was useful," she said. "In context. You said I was easy to keep close." Her voice didn't waver. "Sevran, I have been in enough council rooms. I know what men mean when they're not performing for an audience. That room was the truth of what you think of me, and this room, right now, is the performance." The word hit him harder than a physical blow because the worst kind of accusation is the one that arrives from the exact angle you've never thought to defend. He started to say something. She stopped him. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Her voice dropped, not in volume, in temperature. "It wasn't that you said it. It was that you were comfortable saying it. That's not a man who has careless moments. That's a man who has a private truth, and I just happened to hear it." He stayed crouched in front of her. The fire was dying, and the rain was easing, and the sound of distant wind through pine carried down from the ridgeline above them like a note held far too long. He said nothing. He couldn't, because the specific articulation she had just put on the thing he'd been refusing to look at directly was accurate. He knew the difference between a careless word and an unguarded truth. He had built an entire intelligence apparatus on his ability to make that distinction. To claim he couldn't recognize it in himself would be an insult to the both of them, and he was done, in this particular moment, insulting her. He stood. She stood. They faced each other in a ruined shelter above the borderlands, while an empire waited on the other side of a mountain range, and neither of them was the person the other needed them to be. "Come back anyway," he said. It was the only thing he had left. It was honest, which was something. "No." Her voice was complete. Not hard, not broken. Complete. She reached into her coat and he tensed. Old instinct. But she only produced his courier seal, the secondary one that he had given her for Eastern correspondence, and she held it out to him. He didn't take it immediately. She waited. He took it. The exchange lasted 2 seconds and felt longer than most battles. She picked up her bag. He watched her do it and did not reach out because there are moments when a man recognizes that reaching out will not produce what he wants it to produce, and what he wants it to produce is something that no longer exists in the form that reaching can access. She walked to the rear gap in the wall. She stopped there, not to look back, to speak. "You're an extraordinary king," she said. "I mean that. You see things most people never see, and you do things most people never manage." She paused. "You just stopped seeing me about a year ago. And I didn't realize until tonight that the version of me you kept after, that wasn't a person anymore." She walked out into the rain. Sevran stood in the shelter and let the fire die down to coals around him. And he stood there long enough that the rain stopped and the first gray light of dawn started doing quiet things to the edge of the sky. And he thought about what she'd said and he didn't move. Because she was right about one thing he hadn't expected her to name. A year ago. Not last night, not the words. A year ago, in some corridor he couldn't specifically identify, something had changed in the way he calculated her presence. Not the affection. That was still there. Perhaps more than he'd admitted to himself in that council room with its comfortable laughter. But the seeing. She was right about that. At some point, Aveline Drax had shifted in his mind from a person he was actively present with to an arrangement that was working and therefore required less attention. That was not a cruel decision. It was barely a decision at all. It had happened the way a river changes course, gradually, incrementally, over so many small adjustments that no single moment was the cause, and by the time you looked up, the water was somewhere else entirely. He walked out of the shelter as the gray light deepened. His guards were 100 yards back. They had stayed where he'd left them, which spoke well of their discipline. He could see his horse against the tree line, head down, patient. He could see something else. On the far ridge, 2 figures moving east through pine forest. One smaller, moving with the decisive pace of a woman who had made her decision and was now simply executing it. One larger, moving beside her without crowding her, maintaining a distance that was respectful rather than distant, the particular spatial awareness of a man who understood that presence and pressure were not the same thing. Draven Myrick. Sevran watched them until the tree line took them. He mounted his horse. His lead rider approached, face carefully neutral, the way experienced guards wear neutrality when they have witnessed things above their clearance level and would very much like to continue existing. "Back to the capital," Sevran said. "Yes, Majesty." The ride back through the mountain roads should have taken 3 hours. He rode it faster than that because movement, at least, was something he could control. And control was the architecture of everything he'd ever built. And right now, control was the only thing holding the shape of who he was. He arrived at the palace gates as the morning market was opening in the city below. He dismounted. His chamberlain was waiting, Face doing the particular thing faces do when bad news has been waiting a long time and has rehearsed its own delivery. "The northern delegation arrived at second bell," the chamberlain said. "They're waiting in the East Hall. Councillor Drevin has been asking, tell Drevin the morning session is delayed. How long shall I? Until I say otherwise." He walked past the chamberlain toward his study. His study overlooked the north courtyard where in spring the first trade caravans assembled, and in winter it caught the full gray expanse of the mountain range, and in autumn it held for exactly 3 weeks the particular amber light that came from the angle of sun and the color of the upper forest. He had stood at this window with Aveline once, 2 autumns ago, and she had said something about the light that he had not retained because he'd been looking at a dispatch, and he had said something absent that she had accepted without making him feel the absence. And he had thought at the time that she was good company precisely because she made no demands. And he understood now, with the clarity of a man who has just had something translated for him in permanent ink, that what he had mistaken for the absence of demands was actually the absence of his attention to them. She had been saying things. He had stopped listening long enough ago that he'd forgotten she was speaking. He stood at the north window. The mountain range was gray and misted and enormous and completely indifferent, the way landscapes are indifferent, which is to say, absolutely, with no malice in it. Somewhere out there, moving east through pine forest toward a foreign dominion, a woman who had managed his eastern correspondence for 3 years and slept in rooms 3 corridors from his own and sat beside him at 16 formal dinners and walked through his palace carrying his sealed decrees, was walking away from everything he represented, and she did not look like she was struggling. That was the thing he couldn't put down. Not the leaving, the steadiness of it. He had seen men walk away from him under pressure, and even the bravest among them showed the cost in their shoulders, in the set of their jaw, in the small physiological tells of a body that is paying attention to its own fear. He had built part of his authority on the ability to read those tells and know, in the moment of apparent defiance, how much genuine conviction was underneath it. He had watched Aveline pick up her bag. Her shoulders were down. Her breathing was even. Her face was the face of a woman who had finished a thing and was now simply moving toward whatever came next. And that particular quality of peace was not something that could be performed, which meant it was real, which meant she had been ready for this. Not just tonight, but for long enough that she had built the steadiness in advance. She had been grieving him while he was still in the room. The thought landed in him like cold water. He turned from the window. On his desk, a sealed dispatch from the eastern frontier lay waiting, his intelligence agent's cipher mark in the corner. He broke it open. Read it once. Read it again. His face, which had been doing a series of private things in the privacy of his study, went very still. Then he walked to his door and opened it. His guard was standing post outside. "Get me Captain Hark," Sevran said, "and close the council building to outside traffic until further notice." The guard's expression didn't change. "Majesty, is there a security concern?" Sevran held the dispatch. "That depends," he said slowly, "on whether King Draven Myrick has been in the borderlands for the reason he's claiming." He looked at the paper again. Draven Myrick had not arrived in the borderlands last night. The intelligence report indicated he had been stationed in that abandoned outpost for 3 days. 3 days. Aveline had left this morning. 3 days before she left, the one man positioned to benefit most from Sevran's loss of an asset who handled sensitive Eastern correspondence, who carried sealed council decrees, who moved freely through palace corridors, had been waiting in the one location between Velmora and the Norvac border that appeared on no current guard map. Sevran's jaw tightened. He did not believe in coincidence as a mechanism of political reality. He believed in planning, and if someone had been planning, if Aveline's leaving had been less spontaneous than it appeared, if the conversation he'd had in that council room, the words she'd overheard, had somehow reached her before she heard them. His mind moved through the architecture of it with the terrible efficiency of a man who had built an empire on understanding betrayal before it completed itself. And what he found at the center of that architecture was not what he expected, because Aveline's response had been too clean, too composed, too perfectly timed. He stood in the doorway of his study with the dispatch in his hand and the mountain range gray behind the window glass, and the sound of his empire moving through the morning routines of its own survival in every corridor around him. And he asked himself the question that all rulers eventually face when they have confused loyalty with ownership for long enough. Was she running from him, or had she been guided away? Captain Hark arrived in 4 minutes. That was fast enough to tell Sevran the man had already been awake and moving, which meant the palace's internal nervous system had already registered that something was wrong before anyone used the word for it. Palaces were like that. They ran on information the way bodies ran on blood, and when something disrupted the flow, every extremity felt it before the center had time to issue a diagnosis. Hark was a compact man with the kind of face that had been rearranged by violence often enough that it had settled into permanent readiness. He had served Sevran's father before serving Sevran, which meant his loyalty ran to the throne rather than the man, which was exactly the kind of loyalty Sevran trusted most, because it had no sentiment in it. He entered the study, read the room in 2 seconds, and closed the door behind him without being told. "You pulled the council building," he said. "Read this." Sevran held out the dispatch. Hark read it. His expression didn't change. That was one of his professional virtues. 3 days, Hark said. 3 days. You think he placed her? It wasn't a question. Hark was smart enough to know that if Sevran was showing him this dispatch at dawn after riding to the borderlands and returning alone, the thinking had already been done. "I think," Sevran said carefully, "that Draven Mirek does not make unplanned movements in terrain that borders my territory. I think 3 days is not a coincidence. I think the question is whether she knew." Hark set the dispatch on the desk. He looked at Sevran with the particular directness of a man who has earned the right to say difficult things. "If she knew," Hark said, "what was taken?" The silence that followed had weight. Aveline had handled Eastern correspondence for 3 years. She had carried sealed council decrees. She had moved freely through corridors that most people with twice her formal rank were not permitted to access, because Sevran had granted her access as a matter of convenience, which was now the word he could not stop examining from every direction. Convenience. He had made her useful, and then given her the access required by that usefulness without fully separating those two things in his thinking, because when you trust an arrangement, you stop questioning the architecture that supports it. "I need to know what she touched in the last 60 days, Sevran said. "Every dispatch she handled, every room she entered, every conversation she was present for." He paused. "Do it quietly. I want no one in the council building knowing this inquiry exists. Draven will ask why the building is closed. Tell him a maintenance concern, drainage from the storm." Hark nodded. He moved toward the door. "Hark." The captain stopped. "If this is what it looks like..." Sevran stopped, reconsidered. "If Mirek placed her, the exposure is significant." "I understand." "If she was willing..." He stopped again. Hark turned to look at him. His face was neutral. His eyes were not. "I'll find out what there is to find," Hark said. He left. Sevran turned back to the north window. Here's the thing that most accounts of kings in crisis fail to address, because most accounts are written after the fact, when the crisis has a shape and a resolution, and the people writing it can arrange it into something legible. The thing they fail to address is this. Power does not immunize a man against the specific vertigo of discovering that the harm he thought came from outside may have walked in through his own open door. Every external enemy Sevran had ever faced came with readable signals. A rival king's troop movements, a trade consortium's shifted alliances, a border lord's slow accumulation of grain stores past what local consumption required. He had built an intelligence apparatus specifically to read those signals before they became events, and that apparatus was good, and its goodness had given him a particular confidence in his own capacity to see. What that apparatus could not do was tell him which of the people he had decided to trust were worth the decision. That distinction had always been his. The trust was his. And right now, standing at a window in a palace that had never felt less like solid ground, he was facing the possibility that his most trusted distinction had been his most expensive mistake. He allowed himself 3 minutes of that. He was practiced at rationing discomfort. You could not rule anything for long if you could not do that. Then he sat at his desk, pulled the eastern border map from its cylinder, and began working through the geometry of what Draven Mirek could have been building for 3 days in an abandoned outpost a half-day's ride from Velmora. He worked until Counselor Dreven knocked. The knock was 2 beats, authoritative. The knock of a man who had decided that knocking was a courtesy he offered rather than a permission he sought. Sevran recognized the rhythm and felt a specific variety of irritation that he kept off his face before he said, "Come in." Dreven was a large man going gray at the temples, with the broad construction of someone who had been physically imposing in youth and had settled into commanding in age. He had been on the council for 11 years, which was long enough to have seen 3 different versions of Sevran's governance and to have adapted to each. He was not subtle. He was effective. Those 2 things had kept him useful. He came in, assessed the map on the desk, and sat down in the chair across from Sevran without being invited, which was his standard behavior and which Sevran had long ago decided not to correct because the energy required wasn't worth the result. "Drainage concern," Dreven said. "It was a productive storm." "Evan tells me you rode out before dawn." Avon was Sevran's head groom. Dreven had clearly been asking the right questions of the right people before the 3rd morning bell, which was either admirable diligence or a warning signal depending on what it was in service of. "I rode out," Sevran confirmed. "Alone. With 4 guards." "You haven't ridden with 4 guards since the Brennan campaign." Dreven's voice was steady. His eyes moved to the map, then back to Sevran. "What's in the eastern borderlands?" "Mountains," Sevran said. Dreven looked at him. Sevran looked back. This was a familiar shape between them. 2 men who needed each other and didn't fully trust each other and had built a functional working relationship on the tension between those 2 facts. It was not comfortable. It was durable. "Lady Aveline is absent from morning attendance," Dreven said. "I noticed. Her rooms are empty." "I noticed that as well." Dreven leaned forward slightly. "Sevran, if there's a security concern, I need to know." "You'll know what you need to know." That is, Sevran said quietly, "exactly how this works. You know that. Don't perform surprise at it." Dreven sat back. His jaw worked briefly. He had the expression of a man deciding how much of what he was thinking was worth saying out loud, which was usually the right calculation to make in Sevran's presence. "The northern delegation is waiting," Dreven said finally. "Delay them another 2 hours. Tell them the king is reviewing overnight dispatches. And when they ask about Lady Aveline's role in the Northern Correspondence, tell them her role in the Northern Correspondence has been restructured." Sevran's voice was even. "Tell them the adjustments are recent and the new arrangements will be presented at the formal session." Dreven stood. He paused at the door. "She was good at that work," he said. Not kindly, accurately. "She was excellent at that work," Sevran said. Dreven left. Sevran returned to his map and sat with the specific discomfort of a man who is trying to hold 2 contradictory possibilities in his mind simultaneously without allowing either to collapse into the other prematurely. The discipline required for that was not different in kind from the discipline required for any other form of strategic patience. It was different in quality because the 2 possibilities concerned a person rather than a territory, and he was finding that his tools for thinking about territory were not equally calibrated for thinking about people. The first possibility was that Aveline had heard something true, made a decision, and left. Clean, self-determined. The sort of exit that required nothing from him except the permanent discomfort of having been the cause. The second possibility was that Aveline had been placed, guided, cultivated as an asset by Draven Mirek's network long enough ago that her departure was an operation rather than a choice, and what she carried out of Velmora was more than personal dignity. The problem was that the two possibilities were not mutually exclusive. A woman could be genuinely hurt and still be used. A person could make a real decision, and that decision could still be the decision someone else had been working to produce. The manipulation of genuine emotion was not manipulation's clumsiest form. It was its most sophisticated one. Sevran understood that. He had deployed it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the secondary cipher key from his desk drawer, the one that unlocked the correspondence his intelligence chief routed through the private channel, and he began cross-referencing dates. 3 days ago. Draven Mirek in the borderlands. 6 days ago. A courier from Norvac's Eastern Trade Mission, registered as routine at the Capitol Gate, routed through the lower market district. 11 days ago. A revised set of Eastern Border Transit documents, submitted through the standard channel, signed off by Aveline on his behalf, because that was within her designated authority. He stopped. 11 days ago. He pulled the corresponding log from the side drawer and found the document reference. Standard border transit authorization for a Norvac merchant caravan. Routine. Within parameters. Aveline's secondary seal on the bottom right corner. He stared at it for a long time. The document was not irregular. That was the point. If you were building something, you built it out of regular things placed in an order that only looked like a pattern from the right angle, and only if you were already looking for it. He was looking now. He didn't like what he was starting to see. He was still looking at it when his door opened without a knock, and his personal courier came in with the particular urgency that meant this message had been flagged to move faster than standard routing. The cipher on the outside belonged to his Southern intelligence contact, the one who covered Norvac's border towns. Sevran broke it open, read it, put it down, picked it up, and read it again. The message was 8 lines. It told him that a Norvac military advisor had been seen in the capital's lower district 4 days ago. Not in any official capacity, not registered at any gate, moving in civilian clothes through the market district with the particular comfort of a man who knew the street patterns. 4 days ago. Moving through the lower market, the same lower market district Aveline used as her exit route. Sevran sat very still. Then he called for his horse again. He rode hard and alone, dismissing the guards over their protests, because what he needed now was movement rather than protection, and an audience would compromise both. He rode the lower market route himself, because there are things you understand better when your body moves through them than when your mind processes reports about them. The market was open and loud and smelled of wet stone and charcoal and the particular animal intensity of a city that didn't stop for weather or politics. He moved through it at a walk, because a king on horseback moving fast through a market district was a spectacle, and he was not here to be a spectacle. He was here to see the route. She had walked this route before dawn, in rain, with 1 bag and 4 miles of head start. That was a woman who knew where she was going. You don't navigate a market district in the dark and the rain with that kind of efficiency unless you have either walked the route before or studied it until it was familiar. Had she walked it before? He reached the eastern gate and sat on his horse and looked at the road leading toward the borderlands. 3 miles out, give or take, the road forked. The left fork was the main military road, which had guard posts at regular intervals. The right fork dropped into a lower canyon road that had been a secondary trade route before the border reorganization and now was used primarily by local farmers and travelers who wanted to avoid gate fees. She had taken the right fork. She would have known to take it. He turned his horse and rode back to the palace at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was not comfortable either, and he was thinking about the specific architecture of a plan that was sophisticated enough to use genuine emotion as its foundation and patient enough to let 3 years pass before activating. Because if this was that kind of plan, it was very good work. He could recognize that. He had done that kind of work himself. Captain Hark met him in the courtyard. "Tell me something," Sevran said, dismounting. 11 days ago, Hark said. "The Norvac transit document." Sevran looked at him. "She submitted it through the correct channel," Hark said. "Everything procedurally accurate. But the caravan it authorized. I pulled the arrival record. That caravan checked in at the eastern gate 9 days ago. It is not checked out. A commercial caravan that entered and did not leave. In a border city, a caravan that overstayed its transit authorization was an irregularity. Irregularities required explanation. Explanations, when examined closely, sometimes revealed structures. "Where are they posted?" Sevran said. Lower district, near the old granary. How many? The register says 12. Actual count when I sent a man to look this morning was 23. 23 men registered as a commercial caravan, carrying authorization signed by Aveline, parked near the old granary in the lower district, near the eastern gate, near the route she had used to leave. Sevran's jaw was tight enough to ache. Lock the gate, he said, quietly, and get me 12 men who don't have unit insignia and can move like they're not working. They may not be hostile, Hark said. No, Sevran agreed. But if they're Mirek's men and they're sitting at my eastern gate the morning after Mirek was spotted in my borderlands with a woman who handled my eastern correspondence, then I am going to have a conversation with them whether they're hostile or not. Hark moved. Sevran walked back toward the palace. Here is what people who have never been inside genuine authority do not understand about the experience of betrayal at the highest level of power. It does not arrive as rage first. Rage is a secondary response. The primary response is architecture. The mind that has built systems of control does not, upon discovering a threat, collapse into emotion. It begins immediately building the containment structure. The emotion comes later. It comes in the middle of the night, or in the quiet between decisions, or in the specific hush of a room where the person who should be present is conspicuously not. It comes when the architecture has been built and the decisions have been made and the machinery has been set in motion and there is nothing left to do but be still. And in that stillness, the thing you didn't have time to feel while you were working catches up. Sevran had been in that quiet before. After the Brennan campaign, after his father's death, after the collapse of the Northern Trade Compact that had cost him 2 allies and 3 years of diplomatic work. He knew what it felt like. He was holding it away with both hands right now, and he was very good at that. And he was also aware that the longer you hold something away, the harder it hits when you can't anymore. He entered the palace through the private courtyard. His chamberlain intercepted him near the East Passage. The Northern delegation is, in an hour, Sevran said. Majesty, they've been an hour. He kept walking. Put them in the gallery with wine and tell them I'm reviewing the treaty language. They'll understand that. They review treaty language themselves. He went to Aveline's rooms. He had not given himself permission to do this. He did it anyway. The rooms were as she had left them. His housekeeping staff had not yet entered. He had given no order to clear them, and his staff did not take initiative in spaces that belonged to people adjacent to the king. The rooms held the particular quality of air that collects when a space is abruptly vacated. Not stale, just arrested. Like a sentence stopped in the middle. He stood in the doorway. The jewels were laid out on the dressing table, all of them, arranged with a neatness that he recognized as intentional. This was not the disorganization of hasty departure. This was the deliberate placement of things being left behind, and the difference between those two things mattered. She had laid them out so he would see what she wasn't taking. The iron crown pendant was in the center. He crossed the room and picked it up. It was cold. She'd been gone long enough for the warmth of the room to leave it. He held it and tried to separate what he actually knew from what he was inferring, because the disciplines of intelligence required that distinction even when, especially when, the subject was personal. What he knew, she had left. Draven had been positioned nearby. An unauthorized caravan was sitting at his eastern gate. A Norvac military advisor had been in his city 4 days ago moving without registration. What he inferred, coordination, a plan. A timeline that preceded last night's council conversation. What he did not know, whether Aveline had been a participant in that plan or a subject of it. And this was where the work became genuinely difficult, because his tools for answering that question were the same tools he had failed to apply while she was present, and using them now felt like arriving at a fire with water after deciding earlier that the building was fine. He set the pendant back on the table. He left the rooms. He had a delegation to meet, and a caravan to investigate, and an intelligence inquiry to manage, and a border situation that was either a security crisis or a personal wound and this was the version that required the most careful handling, both simultaneously, layers of damage that would need to be separated and addressed at different speeds. Because the political response and the personal response were not the same response, and confusing them would compromise both. He walked toward the gallery. He had 14 minutes before the Northern delegation's patience ran out. He used 7 of them standing in the corridor outside the gallery door doing nothing visible, organizing the interior of his thinking the way a man organizes a room before company arrives, not to deceive anyone, but to be able to function in it. He had almost gone to her. That was the part he kept returning to between the intelligence assessments and the tactical calculations. Standing at the window this morning, watching her move into the tree line beside Draven, he had almost gone. Not to argue, not to reclaim. Some instinct that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific pain of watching something that had been genuinely important to him move into a distance he understood was permanent. He had not gone. He had told himself it was because of the intelligence reading, the timing, Draven's position, the caravan. That was partially true. The other part was harder to look at. The other part was that in the moment she had said yes to Draven's question and turned east, he had recognized something that his council voice and his king voice and all his trained authority could not address. He had recognized the specific expression of a person who has already grieved you, who has done the internal work of losing you while you were still in the room, still reaching, still performing the gestures of care that had long since ceased to connect to their origin. She had not been leaving him last night. She had been finishing a leave that had already happened, and that recognition had cost him his certainty about what he was actually chasing when he rode out before dawn, because the question was supposed to be about recovering an asset and protecting a position and managing a possible security breach. And underneath all of those legitimate operational concerns was something much simpler and much less manageable. He had lost her. Not last night. Not in the council chamber. Not when she picked up her bag. Earlier. In some corridor of daily habit and strategic preoccupation where he had decided that working arrangements required less attention than they actually did. He had lost her while she was still present, which was the specific variety of loss that doesn't announce itself, which was why it could continue for a year without being named. He pulled his coat straight, opened the gallery door. The northern delegation rose from their chairs with the careful politeness of men who have been waiting long enough to be irritated and are disciplined enough not to show it. 3 men and a trade advisor. Their senior representative was Lord Canner, who had negotiated 3 treaties with Velmora and had the particular wariness of a man who had never fully trusted the ground he stood on during any of them. Your Majesty. Connor's bow was correct. Lord Canner. Sevran sat without preamble because ceremony was a resource and he was rationing everything today. You've had time to review the revised Northern Access provisions. We have. Kenner sat. His colleagues arranged themselves with the practiced synchronization of a delegation that had been briefed on exactly how much to defer and when. We have concerns. Tell me the first one. Kenner glanced at the empty chair to Sevran's right. It was the chair Aveline typically occupied during formal sessions. She took notes. She managed the document flow. Her absence was visible in the specific way that absent things are visible. Not as nothing, but as the shape of a nothing that should be something. Lady Aveline is not present, Canner said. She's not. Sevran's voice held nothing. Her role in these sessions has been restructured. I'll be handling the correspondence function directly for the interim period. The interim period, Canner repeated. His tone was precise. How long is the interim period? As long as necessary. Sevran opened the treaty document in front of him. The Northern Access provisions. A pause. Canner looked at him for 2 seconds longer than the question warranted. Then he turned to his treaty document. The revised language in Clause 14 creates an ambiguity, Canner said. The prior version specified military transit authorization required 30 days' notice. The revision says expedited authorization is available at the king's discretion. That creates an asymmetry that we find concerning. It creates flexibility, Sevran said. Flexibility that only one party can access. Which party would you prefer to be in my position for this negotiation? A beat of silence. Then Canner permitted himself a brief expression that was as close to a smile as he appeared to get. Point taken. The session ran 90 minutes. Sevran moved through it with the particular quality of attention he had learned to produce under adverse conditions. Present enough to be effective, compartmentalized enough to keep the other conversation running in the back of his mind without letting it leak into the visible work. It was a skill. He had paid for it in ways he wasn't fully counting yet. When the delegation withdrew for their midday meal and their own internal deliberations, Sevran remained at the gallery table for a moment of absolute stillness that he allowed himself the way you allow yourself water after a long, dry stretch. His door opened. Hark! The captain's expression told Sevran something before the words did. "The caravan," Sevran said. "We moved on them quietly. 12 men in civilian dress, as you ordered. And they were already moving." Sevran looked at him. "When our men arrived at the old granary, the caravan had already initiated departure. The wagons were loaded. They were heading east. You stopped them." "We stopped them." Hark paused. "Sevran, the wagons." The use of his name without title meant something was coming that required a different kind of attention than the formal channel provided. "What was in the wagons?" Sevran said. "Trade goods. Standard register." Hark's voice was even in the way that voices are even when the person speaking them has already processed the shock and is now in the delivery. "And in the false floor of the third wagon, Eastern Council correspondence, copies, sealed with the secondary cipher." The secondary cipher. The one Aveline managed, the one she had returned to him this morning, after 3 years of access. After 11 days ago, when she had signed a transit authorization for a caravan that was now caught with copies of his council correspondence in a false floor. Sevran sat very still. The full shape of it arrived in him the way cold arrives when you've been moving fast and stop. Not all at once, but as a recognition of something that was already there. "Who's running it?" he said. "The caravan master won't talk. 2 of his men are Norvac military. We identified the unit insignia on their underclothes. Bam." Hart kept his voice professional. "This was a collection operation. The documents go east, get compiled, and Mirek has 3 years of Velmora's Eastern correspondence." 3 years. "How much does he have?" Sevran said. "We don't know. This is one pickup. If there were others..." "Find out if there were others." "Yes." Hark moved toward the door, stopped. "There's one more thing." Sevran waited. "The transit authorization she signed 11 days ago," Hark said. "I pulled her correspondence log for cross-reference. She signed 17 documents in that period. 16 were fully within her standard authority. This one..." He paused. "This one was at the edge. Not outside her authority, but at the boundary of it." "The kind of edge you'd test if you were exploring range," Sevran said quietly. "Or the kind of edge," Hark said carefully, "that someone who knew the system well would use to obscure something by making it almost indistinguishable from routine." Almost. "Whether she knew she was doing it," Sevran said, "or thought she was doing something else." "Yes," Hark said. "That's the question." He left. Sevran remained at the gallery table. The Northern Treaty document sat in front of him. The wine from the delegation's wait was still on the side table, untouched. Through the gallery's high windows, the mountain range was clearing from morning mist into the specific hard clarity of a cold afternoon, peaks visible in detail, the distance between them and the palace explicit and enormous. Somewhere in that range, moving east toward Norvac, Aveline walked beside a king who had been waiting 3 days in an abandoned outpost and who had asked her one question that had cracked the existing structure of her loyalty. "Who laughed at you?" Perfect question. The question of a man who had studied his target, who understood that a woman positioned adjacent to power, recognized for utility rather than personhood, would be responsive to the specific warmth of being actually seen, actually asked, actually considered as a person with an interior rather than an arrangement with a function. You don't ask that question by accident. You ask it when you know the answer, and you know the asking will land. Sevran pressed his palms flat on the table. The thing he had been holding at a distance was getting closer, and he was running out of architecture to put between himself and it. Not the intelligence crisis. That was manageable. That was terrible. And it would cost him, and the recovery would require work he was already calculating, but it was manageable because it was external. It existed in the world, and the world was the territory he knew. What was not manageable, or at least not yet, was the question of what had been real. Because even if every suspicion proved accurate, even if Aveline had been cultivated by Mirek's network long before last night, even if the transit authorization was deliberate rather than incidental, even if her departure was choreographed rather than chosen, there was still the question of what had been true inside the choreography. People used real things. If Mirek had used her genuine pain, her genuine dignity, her genuine response to years of being valued instrumentally rather than personally. If he had leaned on those real things to move her, then the real things still existed. The grief was still grief. The wound was still wound, and Sevran had still made her vulnerable to it. He had done that, not through malice, not through casual cruelty, through exactly what she had named in the broken shelter this morning, through the gradual erosion of seeing while the convenience of her presence continued, through the specifically imperial habit of treating loyalty as infrastructure rather than relationship, through comfort, the comfortable laughter. It was his. He owned that. He stood up from the gallery table, walked to the high window, and looked at the mountains. She was out there, moving toward territory that had spent 4 years preparing to receive her, and he was standing here with a security breach in his eastern correspondence, an unauthorized operation that had run for an unknown duration under his roof, a northern delegation requiring resolution, a council that would eventually need answers, and the specific, total weight of a man who has just discovered that the life he built in the name of strength has been rotting from the inside for longer than he looked. He had one move, not the moves of kings, not cavalry and riders and the authority of a crown. One move. The kind that didn't have a strategic name because it existed outside the vocabulary of power. He had to decide what he actually owed her, not what he could demand back, not what the security situation required, not what his position permitted. What he owed. That was the question no military campaign had ever asked of him, and no intelligence asset had ever forced him to confront, and no council of advisors had ever put on the agenda for review. He stood at the window with the weight of an empire in his posture and the specific private smallness of a man who has missed something enormous and is just now measuring the distance of the miss. Behind him, the gallery door opened. He turned. Hark stood in the doorway. His face had changed. Not the controlled professional stillness of a captain delivering tactical information. Something else. Something that sat underneath the professionalism and was trying to get through it. "Hark," Sevran said. "What?" "The caravan master talked," Hark said. "Not under pressure. He asked to talk." "Why?" "Because—" Hark stopped. Reconsidered. Use the flat voice that men use when they are delivering something they do not have a category for. "Because he's not Mirek's man. He was hired 3 days ago by a separate party. He doesn't know who. He was paid to carry the documents east and present them at the Norvac border post." "Who hired him?" Sevran said. "The description he gave," Hark said slowly, "matches a Velmarin council contact. Someone inside the palace." Sevran stared at him. "Not Mirek," Hark said. "Or not only Mirek. Sevran, someone inside your council was running this. The caravan is not the collection method. It's the delivery." He paused. "The collection was already done. Whoever built this had access that didn't come from Aveline." The room went very quiet. "The transit authorization she signed," Sevran said, "may have been exactly what it looked like," Hark said. "Routine. Unremarkable. Used after the fact by someone who needed a legitimate document in the chain." "To make her the visible point," Sevran said. "Yes." Sevran turned back to the window. The mountains stood in the afternoon light, hard and clear and completely indifferent. Somewhere in his council, the room he had stood outside of last night while comfortable men laughed at a woman's usefulness, someone had been building this for longer than 3 days. Someone who had been in that room. Someone whose laughter he had heard. And Aveline Drax, walking east toward a rival kingdom, carrying her single bag and her recovered dignity, might be walking directly into the middle of something she had never been the architect of at all. Which meant Mirek might not be waiting for an asset. He might be waiting for a witness. Sevran turned from the window. "Get me a horse," he said, "and this time I want 12 men, armed." Sevran rode out of the palace gate before the stable hands finished saddling the second horse. 12 men behind him this time, armed, riding hard. The afternoon light had gone flat and gray by the time they cleared the capital's eastern gate, and the mountain road ahead stretched into the kind of cold clarity that strips a landscape down to its essential geometry: rock, pine, distance, and the specific unforgiving quality of terrain that doesn't care what you need from it. He had left Hark behind, not because Hark wasn't needed, because Hark was needed more in the palace right now, working backward through the council correspondence logs with 4 trusted men and instructions that brooked no ambiguity. Find every document that moved through unofficial channels. Find every authorization that sat at the boundary of normal procedure. Find every name that appeared in proximity to those documents. Find who was laughing, because that was the shape of it now. Not Draven Mirek operating from outside. Not a foreign intelligence operation that had placed an asset and run her for 3 years. Something older and closer and infinitely more corrosive. Someone inside the council chamber. Someone whose voice Sevran knew. Someone who had sat at his table and eaten his food and offered counsel with one hand while building a pipeline to Norvac with the other. The kind of betrayal that doesn't come from enemies. It never does. Here's what distinguishes genuine power from its performance. Genuine power understands that the most dangerous threats are never the ones you can see approaching. They are the ones that grow in the spaces your confidence creates. Every stronghold has the same fatal architecture. The walls face outward. The interior is where trust lives. And trust, in the economy of high power, is the only currency that can be counterfeited without detection until the moment the counterfeit is spent. Sevran had built his intelligence apparatus to read outward threats. He had built his council to manage internal function. He had never fully reckoned with the possibility that those 2 structures could be working against each other in the same corridor, at the same time, under the same roof. That oversight was going to cost him. He was already calculating the cost as he rode, which was how his mind worked under pressure, not sequentially, but simultaneously, running multiple threads without losing the tension in any of them. The security damage was accessible. The correspondence that had been copied, the intelligence on eastern trade routes and border authorizations and the names of his contacts in the northern territories. That was bad, but it was auditable. He could determine scope, he could adapt his methods, he could rebuild. What he could not rebuild with any efficiency was a council he could no longer read with certainty. Because that was the specific damage a successful infiltration inflicted, not the intelligence it extracted, the uncertainty it left behind. Once you knew that someone inside your circle had been operating against you, every face became a question, every document became a possible layer, every conversation acquired a second layer of meaning that you couldn't ignore and couldn't fully decode. Councils ran on baseline trust the way bodies ran on oxygen. Remove it, and you didn't just slow the process, you changed its fundamental nature. He rode harder. The borderland terrain rose steeply as the road climbed past the narrows, where the canyon walls came close enough on both sides that the sky narrowed to a strip of gray, and the horse's hooves echoed differently. His lead rider was a man named Korath, who had the instincts of someone who had spent more of his life outside than in, and Korath raised a fist without looking back when they came out of the canyon onto the upper plateau. Sevran pulled up. Korath pointed east, dust on the far ridgeline, moving fast, moving toward them, a single rider. Sevran felt his men shift into readiness around him, the subtle adjustments of trained soldiers processing a potential threat, weights redistributed, hands moving to appropriate locations, the group breathing changing quality in a way that was almost audible if you knew what to listen for. He held up a hand. Hold. The rider came off the ridge at a pace that was not quite reckless but was not cautious, and as the distance closed, Sevran identified the riding style before he identified the horse, which was dark and eastern-bred and moving with the specific efficiency of an animal that had covered significant ground already today. The rider pulled up 20 yards out. He was young, 20, maybe 22. Norvac livery underneath a travel cloak, the colors muted by road dust but visible to someone who'd been studying Norvac intelligence reports long enough. He carried no visible weapon, which was either genuine non-compliance with threat protocol or a sophisticated read of how to present as non-threatening to an armed party. He looked at Sevran. "King Thorne," he said. Not a question, an identification. "Who sent you?" Sevran said. The rider reached into his coat. Sevran's men tensed, and the rider made the very deliberate choice to move slowly, which again suggested he'd been briefed on exactly what kind of situation he was riding into, and produced a sealed letter. He held it out. Sevran did not take it. He nodded at Korath, who moved forward and took it and passed it back without taking his eyes off the rider. Sevran broke the seal. The handwriting was Draven Mirek's. He'd seen it on enough intelligence documents to know it without needing confirmation. The letter was 8 sentences. He read them. His face did nothing. He read them again. Then he folded the letter and put it inside his coat. "Ride back the way you came," he said to the messenger. "Tell him I received it." The rider turned his horse and went back up the ridge without another word. Sevran sat still on his horse in the cold plateau air and held the contents of those 8 sentences in his mind with the specific care you use when handling something that could cut. Draven Mirik was not at the eastern outpost. He had continued east, and Aveline was with him, and the letter was a communication that fell somewhere between courtesy and warning, which was an unusual register for a rival king to use, and the unusualness of it was doing something to Sevran's thinking that he needed to examine carefully. The letter said, "She came willingly. She is under no compulsion. She will be treated as an honored guest in Norvac until she determines her own course. I have no use for a woman who does not wish to be where she is. I am sending this so you stop riding toward a confrontation that will cost both of us something neither of us can afford right now. There is a conversation we need to have, you and I. It does not have to happen over her." 8 sentences. The last line was doing most of the work. "There is a conversation we need to have, you and I. It does not have to happen over her." Which meant Mirik knew something about what was happening inside Velmora's council. Which meant Mirik was either the architect of it or he was not the architect of it. And the space between those two possibilities was where everything currently lived. "Back to the capital," Sevran said. Korath looked at him. "Majesty?" "Back. Now." They turned. Sevran rode the return at a controlled pace, which cost him because every instinct was pushing toward velocity, and velocity was exactly the wrong response to a situation that required the opposite of reaction. This was the particular discipline that most men in his position lost under pressure. The ability to slow down at the exact moment when everything in the body was demanding speed. The men who had it lasted. The men who didn't left behind object lessons. He had 12 riders and a palace with a compromised council and a letter from a rival king and a woman who was now 3 hours deeper into foreign territory, and the shape of what he was dealing with was finally becoming clear enough to hurt. He rode back through the capital gates as evening came down on the city. Hark met him in the private courtyard. One look at the captain's face was enough. "Tell me," Sevran said, dismounting. "Council chamber." Hark's voice had the quality of something carefully controlled. "You should see it directly." They walked fast through the palace's interior corridors, past the east passage and the gallery, and through the administrative wing to the council chamber. 2 of Hark's men stood post outside the doors. They opened without a word. Inside, 3 men sat at the table. Drevin, Minister Holst, Lord Castle, who managed the Eastern trade accounts. All 3 looked up when Sevran entered. All 3 had the specific quality of men who have been sitting in a room with the truth for long enough that their relationship with pretense has fundamentally broken down. Sevran stood at the head of the table. He looked at them. He said nothing. Here is what silence does in a room full of people who have been caught. It does not create pressure the way speech creates pressure. Speech gives a person something to respond to, something to deflect, something to reframe. Silence gives them nothing except the interior of their own guilt, which is often the most effective prosecutor available. Sevran had learned that from his father. He waited. Holst broke first. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Holst said. Sevran looked at him. "The original arrangement," Holst said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has rehearsed a confession and is now discovering that the rehearsed version is inadequate to the room it's being delivered in. "It was a commercial arrangement, trade intelligence, information about our Eastern tariff schedules, which Norvec already had partial access to through legitimate channels anyway. The additional detail we provided was, 'Who initiated it?' Sevran said." Holst stopped, looked at Drevin. Drevin did not look at anyone. He sat with his hands on the table in front of him and his eyes on the surface of the wood, and his posture had the quality of a large man who has become very aware of the amount of space his body occupies. "Drevin," Sevran said. The counselor's jaw worked. "It started as deterrence," Drevin said. His voice was flat. "No performance." He had apparently made a decision about how to handle this, and the decision was direct, which was either courage or the specific pragmatism of a man who has run out of positions. 4 years ago, after the border reorganization, Mirik was pushing on the Eastern access rights, and we weren't in a position to respond militarily, and I established a back channel. Information for restraint. Mirik agreed to hold the Eastern access dispute in abeyance in exchange for periodic intelligence on our tariff positioning. Periodic intelligence, Sevran said. Trade data. Tariff schedules. Nothing military. And then, Dreven's jaw tightened. And then the scope expanded. How? Gradually. He said the word with the particular self-awareness of a man who understands that gradually is not a defense. Mirek's requests became more specific. Each one was justifiable individually. Each one sat at the boundary of what could be considered sensitive. By the time any single request was clearly over the line, he stopped. You were already in, Sevran said. Yes, this was the shape of it. Not grand conspiracy architected from the beginning. The mundane catastrophe of incremental compromise, each step small enough to be rationalized, the full distance only visible when you turned around and measured how far you'd walked. Most betrayals looked like this from the inside. That didn't make them smaller. It made them harder to prosecute, because the architecture was distributed across dozens of decisions that each had their own internal logic. And by the time the structure was visible, it had been built by a man who could genuinely point to any single brick and say, this one seemed reasonable at the time. But the building was still standing, and it was pointing at Norvac. Aveline, Sevran said. Dreven looked up. Did you use her? The question was flat. The flatness of it was more dangerous than anything else Sevran had said, and all three men at the table felt it. The transit authorization, Dreven said slowly. The one 11 days ago. That was... Mirek's man needed a legitimate document in the chain. Aveline handled Eastern correspondence. He stopped. You used her authorization, Sevran said. She signed it in good faith. She didn't know what the caravan was actually carrying. You used her authorization without her knowledge. Yes. The words sat in the room. Sevran stood at the head of the table and did not move. He was doing the work now that required everything his training had built, holding the rage in a structure that kept it from becoming the primary operating force. Because rage was information, useful information, but it was not a decision-making tool, and right now he needed to make decisions. Aveline had signed a document that she believed was routine. She had been used as a legitimate surface for an operation she had no knowledge of. And then she had walked away from a palace that had treated her as useful, into the arms of a rival king who had been positioned specifically to receive her, positioned by a network that her own inadvertent authorization had helped supply. She had been played by everyone, including, in a specific and irrevocable sense, by Sevran himself. Not through active deception. Through the passive negligence of treating a person as infrastructure, he had made her useful and therefore visible, and then he had failed to protect the vulnerability that usefulness created. That was his fault. He owned that alongside Dreven's. Castle, Sevran said, looking at the third man. Lord Castle managed the Eastern trade accounts. He was 50, precise, the kind of man who appeared in every large institution, not the initiator of anything, not the visionary, not the mover, but the indispensable mechanism through whom things moved and were recorded and made to look normal. How long? Sevran said. 3 years, Castle said quietly. He did not try to reframe it. I processed the document routing. You knew what the documents were. I knew they were going east. That's not what I asked. Castle looked at the table. Yes, I knew. 3 years. While Aveline had been carrying correspondence up and down palace corridors, believing she was serving Velmora's Eastern interests, the man who sat in the room beside her king had been routing copies of that same correspondence to Norvac. The document chain she had participated in as a legitimate actor had been routed around her, through her, using her as both unwitting courier and eventual scapegoat. If the operation had been discovered, her authorization on the transit document would have been the first visible thread to pull. She would have been the most convenient explanation. He thought about her face in the abandoned shelter this morning, the steadiness of it, the way she had spoken without anger, without accusation, with the particular composure of a woman who had spent years learning to trust her own clarity of perception in an environment that consistently undervalued it. She had felt something was wrong, not the specific operational shape of it, but the quality of how she was treated. The cumulative weight of years in which her presence was valued for its function and her person was noticed less and less. She had felt that long before she heard the laughter, and she had been right. The wrongness she felt was real. It just had more layers than she knew. Sevran looked at the three men at the table. He made a decision. "You'll stay in this building," he said. His voice had gone to the register he used when he was past discussion. "All three of you. Your personal guards are relieved. Hark's men are outside that door. You will be given writing materials, and you will produce a full account. Every communication, every document, every contact, every date, starting from the beginning. You will not speak to each other while you produce these accounts. You will not communicate with anyone outside this room without my direct authorization." He paused. "If the accounts are complete and consistent, I will determine consequences at my discretion. If I find omissions, the discretion becomes significantly narrower." He looked at Drevin specifically. "Do you understand what significantly narrower means?" Drevin understood. Sevran walked out of the council chamber and closed the door. He stood in the corridor for 30 seconds. Hark fell into step beside him. "Mirek sent a letter," Sevran said. He pulled it from his coat and gave it to Hark, who read it while they walked. "He wants to talk," Hark said. "He wants to talk." "Do you believe he's separate from what Drevin was running?" Sevran considered. "I believe he benefited from it, whether he architected it or simply received what was offered." He stopped walking. "Draven Mirek is many things. He is not stupid. A man that patient, that positioned, does not pick up caravan intelligence from a compromised council without understanding exactly what he's holding. So he knows. He knows we're looking. The letter is a signal. He's telling me to stop riding east before I create an incident that forces both of us into positions we can't back away from." "Is that what you're going to do? Stop!" Sevran looked at the corridor wall. At nothing specifically. At the particular blankness of a man staring into a calculation that has no clean answer. "She's in his territory," he said. "She's there willingly, or she believes she went willingly, which is its own kind of reality. If I ride east with 12 armed men and cross the border, I'm starting something that doesn't end at a conversation." He paused. "And if I don't ride east, she stays in Norvac with a man who has 3 years of my eastern correspondence and the political advantage that comes from having the woman who handled it." "What does he actually have on her?" Hark said carefully. "Her signature on a document she didn't know was operational," Sevran said. "In Norvac's version of this, that signature makes her a participant. In my council's version of this, that signature makes her a scapegoat." He paused. "In reality, she's neither. But reality is not what drives political consequence. Optics drive political consequence." Hark was quiet for a moment. "So she's caught between two kings," he said. "And neither one has been honest with her." The corridor was empty around them, the palace settling into its evening rhythms, and Sevran felt the specific weight of a situation that had no good options, only options of varying cost that required a choice about what you were willing to pay. He had been here before in other forms. Military campaigns where every route had unacceptable exposure. Diplomatic negotiations where every position had collateral damage. Political moments where the question was not how to win cleanly, but how to lose as little as possible while preserving the capacity to recover. He had never been here with a personal stake in the outcome. That was the variable he kept returning to, the one that complicated every clean calculation. Because his thinking on Aveline was not clean. It had not been clean since he stood at his north window this morning and felt the specific weight of watching someone he had genuinely cared about walk into a tree line without looking back. And the feeling was not strategic, and it was not political, and it did not care about the intelligence breach, or the council crisis, or the correspondence pipeline to Norvac. It was simpler than all of that. And simpler things, Sevran was learning, were often harder to manage than complex ones. He walked to his study. He sat down. He pulled a fresh sheet of correspondence and a cipher key. He wrote to Draven Mirek, not as a king responding to a rival, as a man responding to another man's uncommon directness. He wrote 7 sentences. He said, "You chose your position 3 days before she left. I want to know why. Not what you extracted. I know what the correspondence contained. I want to know why you were there personally. Men who run operations don't stand in the rain to receive the result. You were there for a different reason. Name it." He sealed it with his personal cipher, not the royal seal. He sent it with a single fast writer. Then he sat in his study and did the thing that powerful men rarely do and almost never admit to. He waited. Not for intelligence, not for a tactical update. He waited in the specific discomfort of a situation that he could not fully control, in which the next meaningful move belonged to someone else. And the waiting required him to be still inside a stillness that was not strategic, but simply the plain fact of limits. He had acted badly, not dramatically, not cruelly. In the specific mundane way that people act badly when they stop paying attention, by treating the presence of another person as a given rather than a continuing choice, by mistaking the absence of visible pain for the absence of pain, by letting the distance between private affection and public accountability grow until the gap was wide enough to swallow someone whole. He had never thought of Aveline as expendable, but he had behaved as though her position was permanent regardless of how he treated it, which was a distinction without a practical difference from her vantage point. And now she was in a foreign king's territory, and her signature was on a document she hadn't knowingly compromised, and the men who had actually compromised it were sitting in his council chamber writing confessions, and none of that resolved anything for her. The writer returned before midnight. Mirek's response was 5 sentences. Sevran read them. Then he read them again with the expression of a man who has just had the floor shift under him in a direction he did not anticipate. Mirek had not been there for Aveline. He had been there for Drevin. He had been tracking Drevin's operation from the outside for 2 years, not because he was the recipient of it, but because he had not been the initiator of it, and he wanted to know who had been. Someone had approached Drevin 4 years ago, claiming to represent Norvac's interests. The caravan system, the document pipeline, the incremental expansion of scope, none of it had been Mirek's design. He had been receiving copies of Velmorin correspondence from a channel he had not opened and could not fully close without triggering a confrontation he didn't want. Someone had framed this operation as Mirek's, and that someone was not in Norvac. Sevran set the letter down. The implications moved through him in sequence, each one arriving faster than the last. The full architecture of it, assembling with the cold, terrible efficiency of a structure revealing itself from behind inadequate cover. If Mirek had not initiated the operation, if someone had created a Norvac-attributed pipeline specifically to move Velmorin intelligence eastward, then the question was not who had access to Norvac, but who wanted Sevran looking at Norvac while the real operation ran in a direction he wasn't watching. Drevin had said it started as deterrence. He had said Mirek's man approached him, but Mirek's letter said no such approach from our side, which meant Drevin had been approached by someone representing themselves as Mirek, which meant the intelligence running east to Norvac might not have been the actual destination, which meant there was a third party. Sevran stood up so fast the chair went back. He had 12 men outside. He had Hark. He had a council chamber with 3 men writing confessions that might be telling him the wrong story, not because they were lying, but because they themselves did not know the full story. He had a palace that he was no longer certain he controlled in the ways he had assumed he controlled it. And somewhere in the Eastern Territory, Aveline was sitting in a foreign king's keep with Mirek, who was apparently as confused about the actual architecture of this operation as Sevran was, which meant she was not safely positioned as an asset in enemy hands. She was loose in a situation whose full shape no one yet knew, including her. He opened the study door. Korath was outside, which meant someone had anticipated that the night was not going to resolve into sleep. "Get Hark," Sevran said. "Get him now." He walked back to the council chamber. The 3 men inside were still writing. Cassell had produced 4 pages. Holst was on his second. Drevin had written half a page in a hand that pressed so hard the letters were visible from the other side of the parchment. Sevran came in without ceremony. All 3 looked up. "Drevin," he said, "the man who approached you 4 years ago. Describe him." Drevin blinked. He was a Norvac trade representative. He had credentials. Describe him physically." Drevin described him. Sevran turned to Holst. "Did you ever meet this representative?" "Once," Holst said carefully, "at the East Market meeting 3 years ago." "Same man?" Holst looked at Drevin. Back at Sevran. "I don't know. The man I met was..." He described him. Different height, different coloring, same credentials. Sevran stood in the council chamber with the cold certainty of a man who has just understood that the trap he was examining was not the trap. The trap was the room he was standing in. He had sent Hark backward through the document trail. He had put 3 men in a room and was reading their confessions. He had been building his understanding of the breach from the inside of the palace looking east. The east was not the direction. Someone had designed this to look like Norvac. Funded the operation, cultivated Dreven's participation, established credentials, built a pipeline, and pointed it at a rivalry that already existed because existing rivalries were the best available infrastructure for a new operation. You didn't need to create the suspicion. You just needed to be in the right position when it activated. Hark arrived in the doorway. Sevran looked at him. The correspondent's castle routed, Sevran said. Where did it physically go? Not the registered destination. Where did the riders actually go? Hark looked at Cassel. Castle's face changed color. And in that color change, in the specific gray-white of a man whose secondary deception has just been reached, who has told one truth and is now looking at the question behind it, Sevran found the edge of the real shape. Where? Sevran said. Cassel looked at the table. Castle, Hark said quietly, and the quiet was the most dangerous register available. Where did the correspondence go? South, Castle said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Not east, not Norvac, south, where the mountain range opened into the trade territories, where 3 merchant houses controlled the primary cargo routes, where a competing empire had been probing Velmora's eastern boundary for 6 years with the patience of an organization that thought in decades rather than campaigns. South. Sevran stood in the council chamber as the full shape of what had been built against him finally came clear, and it was larger than he had built his walls to address, and it had been operating inside those walls long enough to know exactly where they were thin. And the woman who had walked out of his palace this morning carrying nothing but her dignity was currently sitting inside a confusion she had no tools to decode in a foreign territory, at the convergence point of something that made the intelligence breach look like its own cover story. He turned to Hark. Lock the south gate, he said. Every courier route out of the capital. Nothing moves until I say so. He paused. And get me every intelligence file we have on the Southern Trade Consortiums. Hark was already moving. Sevran looked at the 3 men at the table. He looked at Cassel specifically. You're going to tell me everything, he said. Not the version you rehearsed. Everything. Starting with who paid you directly, not who you believed was paying you, who actually put the coin in your hand. Cassel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Lord Brennan's trade house, he said. Sevran went very still. Lord Brennan, who had been at the East Wall meeting 3 years ago, who maintained the largest independent trade operation in the Southern Territories, who had sat across from Sevran at 6 formal dinners and drunk his wine and offered counsel and laughed at comfortable things in council chambers, who had attended every session in which Aveline had been present, who had, 3 months ago, inquired about the Eastern Correspondence Protocols, who had, Sevran now recalled with the retrospective clarity of a man reading a map he should have read months ago, expressed an interest in Aveline's management of the secondary cipher. At the time, Sevran had read it as courtly interest, the mild attention of a man to a capable woman in proximity to power. He had read it wrong. He had been reading this wrong for a long time. And Aveline, who had noticed things, who had always noticed things, who had been paying attention in rooms where powerful men forgot she could hear, was sitting in Norvac's eastern fortress without knowing that the thing that had pushed her out of Velmora had nothing to do with comfortable laughter. She had been moved, deliberately, precisely. At the exact moment when her presence in Velmora was becoming a liability to an operation that could not afford a witness who noticed things. He had called her loyal, useful, easy to keep close. Someone else had called her dangerous. And the most terrifying thing about a person who notices things is not what they know. It is what they might eventually connect. Sevran walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The palace around him was full of men he was no longer certain of, and the empire beyond its walls was full of operations he was no longer certain he understood. And the woman he had failed in the specific way that matters most, not through cruelty but through the long, slow negligence of treating a person as a convenience, was somewhere in the dark between 2 territories with a target on her that had nothing to do with love or rivalry or the comfortable laughter of councilmen. She was a liability to Brennan's operation, and Brennan's men were in the south, but south and east shared a border road. Sevran turned back to Hark, who had come back through the door at the speed of a man who had heard enough to reach his own conclusions. East, Sevran said. Now. And this time we don't stop at the borderlands. He was already moving. There are moments in the life of a king where the throne stops being the point. Not because the throne doesn't matter. It does, and the men who pretend otherwise lose them, but because some things are more primary than power, and the refusal to recognize them is not strength. It is the specific blindness that power produces when it's been unchallenged long enough to mistake its own appetite for clarity. Sevran Thorne had built an empire on his ability to see. He had stopped seeing one person. And that single failure had been the exact gap that people who understood him far better than he understood himself had walked straight through. He was not going to make her pay for his blindness twice. He ran. He rode like the road owed him something. 12 men behind him, and Sevran set a pace that wasn't sustainable for long distances. But the distance didn't matter because what mattered was the window. And windows in operational situations had the specific quality of closing faster than you expected and staying closed after. He had made that mistake once in the Brennan campaign, riding at a measured pace toward a position he believed was secure. And he had arrived at a position that had been secure 40 minutes earlier. He had not made that mistake since. The night road east through the mountain pass was wide enough for 2 horses abreast and lit by a 3/4 moon that gave the pine forest on both sides a quality of depth that was either useful or threatening depending on what was in it. Korath rode 20 yards ahead, reading the road with the particular attention of a man who understood that ambush preference was predictable if you understood the terrain, and terrain on the East Pass had 3 locations that a competent unit would use. They cleared all 3 without contact. That was either good news or information. Sevran was treating it as information, because if Brennan's network was operational and had been watching the palace, and a network sophisticated enough to run a 3-year correspondence pipeline while pointing the attribution at a foreign king was absolutely watching the palace, then they knew he had ridden east before midnight with 12 armed men. And they would have done the calculation he was doing, and they would be moving. The question was whether they were moving toward Aveline or away from her. He pushed the pace harder. Here is what separates leaders who survive genuine crisis from those who don't. And it is not what most people assume. It is not strength. It is not tactical brilliance or physical courage or the specific charisma that makes men follow into situations they understand are dangerous. Those things matter, and they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. What separates survivors from casualties in true crisis is the capacity to act from absolute clarity about what the objective actually is, while every circumstance is designed to confuse you about that objective. The confusion Sevran was riding through was elaborate, multi-layered, built by people who understood his thinking well enough to anticipate the directions he'd look. They had given him Dreven's betrayal to investigate, Murek's territory to ride toward, Castle's document trail to follow backward. Each thread was real. Each thread pulled his attention in a direction that was not the center. The center was a woman who noticed things. And Brennan's people had decided she needed to not be in the palace anymore before she noticed the specific thing that would collapse the southern operation entirely. He didn't yet know what that thing was. He was going to find out. Korath raised a fist. Sevran pulled up hard, his horse throwing its head and dropping its hindquarters against the sudden demand. The men behind him compressed and steadied with the practiced efficiency of a unit that had drilled this transition until it was muscle rather than thought. Korath held still, listening. Sevran listened too. The night sounds of the pass were their own language, wind in the upper pine, the particular rhythm of stones settling in cold, the occasional distant water. What was not present was also readable. Certain animals went quiet when larger predators moved through. The quality of quiet at this particular bend in the pass had shifted in the last 30 seconds from natural to held. Something was in the trees on the right side of the road, not the left. Left was a drop, 20 feet of rock face to the creek below. Anyone who understood the terrain would use the right, which offered ground cover and multiple exit angles. Sevran did not draw his weapon. He raised his voice instead. "Brennan's men," he said, not loudly enough. "I'm going to tell you what I know, and then I'm going to tell you what happens next, and then you're going to make a choice." Silence. The held kind. "I know the southern route," he said. "I know Castle's routing. I know the second set of credentials used on Dreven. I know what the correspondence was actually being used for, which is not what Dreven thinks it was being used for." He paused. You've got two options. You come out and talk to me, or you try whatever you came here to try, and I want you to make that second choice with the understanding that I have 12 men, that I left a full account of everything I know with Hark at the palace, and that Lord Brennan's window closed about 40 minutes ago when Castle started telling me things he should have told me 2 years ago. Just talk. A long pause, then a voice from the tree line, low, careful. How many men does Hark have? More than you, Sevran said. Another pause. We're not here for you, the voice said. I know that, Sevran said. That's why I'm talking instead of fighting. Who are you here for? Silence. Then, we have instructions. From Brennan. From a contact. I don't deal with principals directly. Your contact told you to ride east tonight. Our contact told us there was a loose end at the Norvac border. Aveline. The word loose end landed in Sevran's chest with a weight that had nothing political in it. A loose end. That was the operational language for a person who had been close enough to the machinery to have absorbed information without knowing they'd absorbed it, who was now positioned outside the control of the people running the machinery, and who therefore needed to be resolved. Resolved. He kept his voice even. Your contact's instructions are already burned, Sevran said. The operation is compromised from the palace end. Whatever you do at the border doesn't help Brennan. It just puts you personally in a position I'm not going to be flexible about. A long silence from the trees, then the sound of someone moving. More than one person. The forest settling back into its natural sound patterns as weight was redistributed through it in the direction away from the road. They were going, not toward the border, away from it. Professional calculation. The kind that operators make when they understand that an operation has gone cold and continuing to execute specific tasking against a target when the strategic purpose has collapsed is not dedication, it is exposure without return. Sevran let them go. He turned to Korath. Ride back to that first fork and block the south cutoff. Hold it until Hark's men arrive. He looked at two of the other riders. With him. That left 9. He rode east. The Norvac border crossed a river that ran cold year-round from mountain snowmelt, and the crossing was marked by a stone post on each side that served more as a formality than a barrier. The actual boundary was managed by patrol schedules rather than physical structure, which meant crossing it at night was not an incident unless you were caught crossing it by the wrong patrol. He crossed it. His remaining riders crossed behind him, and no one spoke about what crossing a foreign border with armed men at midnight implied, because they were men who had signed on for the kind of service that occasionally required doing things that were not technically permitted and trusting the man giving the orders to manage the consequence. Sevran intended to manage it. He rode another mile into Norvac territory before he saw the lights of the eastern fortress on the ridgeline. It was not a large fortress, but it was old and well-positioned, the kind of structure built by someone who understood that defensive advantage was worth more than size, perched at the junction of two approach angles with walls that gave a clear view of the valley road in both directions. Someone in that fortress had already seen them. He slowed. He was calculating the geometry of the next 10 minutes when a rider came down the valley road from the fortress at a pace that was controlled rather than urgent, which meant this was expected rather than reactive. He had been watched from the moment he crossed the river. The rider was Draven Mirik, alone. He pulled up 20 feet from Sevran and sat on his horse in the moonlight, with the specific quality of stillness that Sevran had noticed in the abandoned shelter this morning. The stillness of a man who had made peace with whatever the next minute was going to bring, and was therefore not spending energy managing his own anxiety. They looked at each other, two kings on a valley road in the middle of the night with an army's worth of reasons to be enemies, and a specific immediate situation that required them not to be. You got my second letter, Draven said. Castle confirmed it, Sevran said. South, not you. Not me. Draven's voice was level. For what it's worth, I've been trying to determine the actual origin for 8 months. Whoever built it used my credentials well enough that from inside my own intelligence structure it looked clean. Someone built a Norvac-attributed operation using your real credentials. Using credentials that were close enough to real to pass initial scrutiny. Not perfect, but the people receiving them weren't looking hard. Because they wanted to believe it was you, because it fit the existing narrative. Draven's jaw was tight. Your council already had reason to be wary of Norvac. We've been in a low-level border dispute for 4 years. An operation attributed to me exploiting that tension was not a difficult thing to make credible. The sophistication of it was not lost on Sevran. You don't manufacture suspicion. You find suspicion that already exists and you put what you need inside it. The correspondence that went south, Sevran said. Do you know what it was used for? I know what Brennan's operation is, Draven said. We've been tracking it from our side for 6 months. He's building a case, not a military case, a commercial one, documenting Velmore's Eastern tariff practices, your border authorization protocols, the specific preferential terms you've been offering Northern trade partners, building a case that those terms violate the Southern Compact agreements. Sevran went still. The Southern Compact, signed 8 years ago, a multi-party trade agreement that guaranteed equal access terms across the Southern Trade Corridor, one of the foundational documents of the current regional stability. An agreement that Sevran's Eastern tariff practices had been, in certain specific applications, not technically compliant with for at least 3 years, not maliciously, not as strategy. As the ordinary consequence of managing competing trade priorities without fully auditing the compliance implications of each individual adjustment. But compliance was not the point. The point was that 3 years of correspondence documenting those practices, in the hands of a man who understood how to present information to a trade arbitration body, was not an intelligence advantage. It was a legal weapon. He's going to arbitration, Sevran said. He's going to arbitration, Draven confirmed. With 3 years of your own correspondence as the evidentiary base. Your seal, your authorization, your protocols documented in your own words by the people who implemented them. The geometry of it was almost elegant in the way that genuinely sophisticated operations were elegant. Not flashy, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that appeared in stories about kings and battles. A commercial legal case built over 3 years using access granted by corrupted insiders pointed at a trade agreement violation that was real enough to be damaging, timed to coincide with a Northern Treaty renegotiation that would make Velmore's position maximally exposed. Not an attack, a verdict. Sevran looked at Draven. Where is she? The shift in subject was not subtle. Draven met it without deflection. Inside, 2nd floor. She's been told what I know about the operation. Not everything, what I could confirm. He paused. She took it well. Better than most people take finding out they've been used as a mechanism. How did she respond? She asked 3 questions, Draven said. The first was about the transit authorization. The second was about Castle's routing. The third... He stopped. The third. Draven looked at him with an expression that was not quite readable. The third was whether you knew. The words landed in Sevran's chest and stayed there. Whether you knew, not whether he had sent her away. Not whether the council's behavior was his fault, whether he had known that she was being used, specifically, deliberately, as a mechanism in an operation designed to move against his own interests. She had asked that, which meant that even in the middle of discovering the full scope of what had been done to her, her thinking had moved immediately to the question of his culpability versus his blindness, which was either the thinking of a woman who wanted to find him guilty or the thinking of a woman who still had enough investment in the truth of who he was to want to distinguish between those two things. He held that possibility with the care it deserved. What did you tell her? He said. I told her I didn't know, Draven said, which is accurate. I don't know. I didn't know, Sevran said. A pause. I know, Draven said quietly. I worked that out. The acknowledgement between them was not warm, but it was real, the recognition between 2 men who had been operating in the same confusion from different positions and had arrived at the same center by different routes. I need to talk to her, Sevran said. Draven was quiet for a moment. She's not a political asset, he said. Whatever happens between you and her, that's her choice. I'm not trading her. I know that. I want to hear you say it clearly. Sevran looked at him directly. She's not a negotiating position. She's not a recovery operation. I'm not here to bring her back, and I'm not here to argue jurisdiction. He paused. I'm here because she needs to know the full shape of what was done to her before she makes any further decisions about where she is and why. And because... He stopped. Draven waited. Because the specific way I treated her made her vulnerable to exactly the kind of approach that moved her, Sevran said. And she deserves to hear that from me directly, not as a tactic, as a fact. Another silence. Draven turned his horse toward the fortress. Come, he said. Your men stay at the gate. Sevran signaled his riders to hold and followed Draven up the valley road toward the fortress. The interior of the eastern fortress was smaller than it appeared from outside, and significantly better maintained than the exterior suggested. The walls that looked weathered from a distance were structurally sound, the corridors were lit with functional rather than ceremonial light, and the whole place had the quality of a working military installation rather than a political showpiece. Draven lived the way he governed, without performance. Sevran noted this the way he noted everything, not as approval exactly, but as data about the kind of man he was dealing with. They went up stone stairs to the second floor. Draven stopped at a door and knocked twice. A pause. Then Aveline's voice, clear and level. Come in. Draven opened the door and stepped aside. Sevran entered alone. The room was spare. Stone floor, one window facing east where the mountains were beginning to differentiate themselves from the sky in the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn. A table. 2 chairs. A fire that had been burning long enough to have generated actual warmth rather than merely the appearance of it. Aveline sat in the chair facing the door. She had known it would be him. Her face showed that she had known, which meant Draven had told her he was coming, which meant Draven had made a choice about information that was itself a statement about the kind of man he was. She looked at Sevran. She looked different from the woman he had watched walk into the tree line this morning. Not in appearance, in posture. Something had settled in her since the Borderlands, the specific settling that happens when a person discovers that the confusion they've been living in had an external architecture rather than an internal origin. The relief of learning that the wrongness you felt was real and the source of it was not you. That kind of discovery doesn't feel like winning. It feels like ground. She had found some ground. He sat in the chair across from her without being invited, because asking for permission in this moment would have been a performance, and they were past performances. How much did Draven tell you? He said. Enough, she said. Brennan's operation. The southern route. The arbitration case. She paused. The transit authorization. You didn't know what the caravan was carrying. No. Her voice was steady. I processed it the same way I processed the other 16 documents that week. Within my authority. Routine. I didn't look deeper because I had no reason to. She looked at him. Someone designed it that way. Yes. Castle. Castle routed it. Draven opened the channel. Someone above both of them designed the structure. He paused. I don't yet have a direct line to Brennan, but I will. She absorbed this. You didn't know, she said. Not a question. No. She looked at him for a long moment with the specific quality of attention she had always had. Direct and without deflection. The look of someone who was not trying to find what she wanted to find, but what was actually there. I believe you, she said. The simplicity of it landed harder than any accusation would have. That's not why I came, he said. I know. I came because... He stopped. Tried again. What I said in that council room. What you heard. That was true in the specific way that things are true when you've stopped thinking about them and are just operating from what's convenient. And what's convenient when you've been running an empire for 6 years with a person 3 corridors down who manages your correspondence and never makes demands and is always exactly where you expect her to be, is to stop thinking of that person as a person. She was watching him. I did that, he said. Not last night, gradually. Over enough time that I didn't feel the moment it happened. And when you say the word useful in a room full of men who don't question you, you mean it as shorthand for something more complicated, but shorthand is what it sounds like when someone is standing outside the door, and shorthand was, it was accurate, she said quietly. Yes, that's what made it hurt. She looked at the window. The gray of coming dawn was cleaner out there. It wasn't slander. It was just, you said it comfortably. The way you'd say a door is well hung or a road is maintained, something functional that does what it's supposed to do. He said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to that. It was the most precise articulation of the specific failure, and the most precise articulations were the ones that didn't need response. Draven asked me who laughed at you, she said. When we were in the shelter, I didn't answer him, but I understood why he asked it. She paused. He knew the answer didn't matter as much as the question, that the question was the part that was different. Sevran looked at the man's empty chair, at the room around him, at the door Draven had closed when he left them alone. He positioned himself there for a reason, Sevran said, even if that reason wasn't the one I assumed. I know, Aveline said. He told me. He wasn't there for me specifically. He was tracking Draven's operation. She paused. The question he asked was real regardless. I know. People do things for mixed reasons. That doesn't make every part of it false. She was talking about Draven. She might also have been talking about Sevran. He wasn't certain she was distinguishing between them in this specific sentence, and he didn't ask. He looked at her directly. What I came to say, he said, is that you were right about what you told me. Not just in the shelter, about the year, about the distance that had grown between who you actually were and what I was registering when I looked at you. I had stopped seeing you. And the person who had stopped seeing you was not going to have the conversation we needed to have, because you can't have that conversation with someone who has stopped believing you're present enough to have it. She was still. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. That's not what this is. I'm telling you that the thing you named was real, and the person responsible for it is me, and you were right to name it and right to leave. And the fact that it turns out someone used your leaving as operational cover for an intelligence theft doesn't change any of that. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She had done whatever crying she was going to do before he arrived, which was consistent with everything he knew about how she processed things. Privately, completely, and without leaving evidence for the people she didn't fully trust. Why does it matter, she said, that you're saying this? Because the alternative is that you spend the next several years believing that the thing you heard in that corridor was the whole truth about what you were to me. And it wasn't. He paused. It was part of the truth. The comfortable, unexamined part. The part that operates when you've stopped doing the work. But it wasn't all of it. She looked at him for a long time. What was the rest? She said. Someone I should have been paying attention to, he said. Someone who was doing work I undervalued because I had stopped distinguishing between the work and the person doing it. And before that, when I was still paying attention, someone I actually chose to be around. Not because it was convenient, because it wasn't convenient, and I did it anyway, which is the only honest definition of choosing. She looked away, toward the window. The dawn was coming faster now, the eastern peaks going from gray to the first pale gold at their edges, the specific light that arrives before actual sunrise and makes everything temporarily equal, the close distances and the far ones all the same tone. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said. I know. I can't go back to what it was. I know that too. Even if you... She stopped, started again. Even if you mean everything you're saying right now, which I think you do, the structure doesn't change. The palace, the council, the role I had in it. She paused. I was a mechanism in a system that ground me down so gradually I didn't feel it happening. And the fact that part of that grinding was done by people working against you doesn't change the part that was just ordinary negligence. No, Sevran said. It doesn't. She turned to look at him. Something moved in her face. Not resolution. Something more uncertain than resolution. The look of a person standing at the edge of a decision they don't yet have enough information to make. Why did you really ride east tonight, she said. And I want the full answer, not the part about the operation. He held her gaze. Because when Hark told me Brennan's people had been given tasking near the border, he said, the first thing I felt was not political calculation. It was... He stopped, said it plainly. Fear, for you specifically. Not for the correspondence you'd handled or the signature on Castle's document or the intelligence exposure. For you. She was quiet. That's the full answer, he said. The room held the silence for a long moment. Then the door opened. Draven. His face had the quality of a man carrying information that required immediate delivery and had made the judgment call that the emotional weight of the room was not more important than the operational weight of what he was bringing into it. Riders, he said. South Road, moving fast. He looked at Sevran. Not your men. Sevran was on his feet before the last word landed. How many? 12? 15. Draven's voice was clipped. Armed. Moving without torch, which means they don't want to be seen, which means they know the road. Brennan's men. Not the group from the pass. A second group. The operational redundancy of an organization that had spent enough time building something to know that single-point failures were a design flaw. Sevran looked at Draven. The two kings occupied the same 3 seconds of assessment, reaching the same conclusion from their respective positions. And the conclusion had the quality of a decision that was going to reshape what came after it, regardless of how they individually felt about the present circumstances. Your men, Sevran said. Already moving, Draven said, but they're going to hit the south approach before we can fully position. How many do you have here? 20 in the fortress, 12 on the valley approach. I have 9 on the road. That's enough if we move now. Draven looked at Aveline. Something passed between them that Sevran read as the specific communication between people who have spent several hours in close proximity to genuine danger and have reached an understanding about it. Inside room, no windows. Do you know where? Yes, she said. She was already standing. She looked at Sevran. One look. Not long. It carried more than the available time allowed for. The compressed weight of a conversation that wasn't finished, of a truth that had been spoken without a resolution attached, of two people standing in the specific suspension of a moment that cannot be extended because the world has decided it ends now. Then she moved. Draven was already in the corridor. Sevran followed, and they went down the stairs together at a pace that was not quite running, the pace of men who understand that the difference between controlled fast movement and panicked movement is the difference between maintaining tactical coherence and losing it, and tactical coherence was the only thing standing between the south approach and whatever Brennan had decided was worth 12 men in the dark. They hit the ground floor. Draven's guards were already in position, moving with the efficiency of men who had been briefed and who had the specific quality of readiness that comes from actually believing in the man they were positioned to protect. The south gate of the fortress yard opened onto a 50-foot approach that ended at the valley road. Sevran's 9 riders were visible at the tree line, already turned and positioned, reading the sound of incoming horses. The sound was close now, closer than the timeline suggested, because they had not come from the south road. They had come through the canyon shortcut that ran east of the river, which meant they knew the terrain, which meant someone had given them detailed route information, which meant this was not a reactive operation. This had been planned for tonight specifically, before Castle had talked, before Sevran had ridden east, before the operation in the palace had been compromised. The plan had anticipated the compromise. Sevran processed this in the 2 seconds between hearing the hooves close and the first rider coming out of the eastern tree line into the fortress approach. And what he processed was the specific cold intelligence that the most dangerous operational position is not when your enemy is stronger than you. It is when your enemy has already anticipated your response. He drew his sword. Beside him, Draven Myrick drew his. 2 kings in a fortress yard in the dark, swords out, watching 15 armed riders fan into approach formation with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before, against targets who had not expected them, and who were therefore already inside the assumption that this would go the same way. That assumption was the one thing Sevran could use. He looked at Draven. Draven looked at him. No words. There are moments in military engagements where language becomes irrelevant because the people occupying the same ground have reached the same assessment simultaneously, and the communication required is not linguistic. It is the specific alignment of 2 minds looking at the same problem from adjacent positions and arriving at the same answer. They had arrived. Sevran raised his voice, and it cut the night air with the specific quality of a command that has been trained into the marrow of everyone in earshot. South and east, he said. Hold the approach. Nothing gets to the stairs. His riders moved. Draven's guards moved. The 15 incoming riders hit the fortress approach at full speed and drove directly into a position that was not what they had anticipated, because men planning a night raid on a location they believe contains 1 woman and a small Norvac garrison are not planning for the king of Velmora in the yard with 9 armed riders, and a rival king who had placed his guards 40 seconds ahead of the contact. The collision happened fast and loud and close. Sevran was in it. This is what men who have only read about combat do not understand. It is not heroic. It is not the clean arc of a story. It is noise and proximity and the specific violence of bodies and metal occupying the same small space at speeds that don't allow for reconsideration. It is the sound of a horse going sideways and the immediate decision about where the next threat is, and the next, and the next, each one arriving faster than a man can fully process, which means you stop processing and start operating from the deep training that lives underneath cognition. Sevran had trained since he was 11. He operated now from that training, and the training was good, and the first two contacts he handled with the economical violence of a man who did not enjoy fighting, but had made peace with what effectiveness required. And then there was a moment, brief, maybe 2 seconds, where the approach cleared enough for him to stand in something approaching stillness and see the yard. His men were holding. Draven's guards were holding. The raiding party had not anticipated the doubled force, and underprepared men in a night engagement, when they discover the position is not what intelligence indicated, have a choice between recalibrating and breaking. And this group was breaking at the edges. 2 riders already turned toward the tree line, 2 more following. The remaining 11 were not breaking. The remaining 11 had found a new objective. Because the staircase was unguarded. Because everyone in the yard, including Sevran, had moved to the approach. Because whoever had designed this operation had anticipated that response. Because the approach was not the objective. The stairs were the objective. Aveline was on the 2nd floor. Sevran turned. 3 of the 11 were already inside the ground floor entry. He ran. He hit the entry corridor moving at full speed, which was a calculated risk because corridors removed lateral options, and a man with no lateral options was a man with a specific vulnerability. But the alternative was 3 armed men on a staircase between him and the 2nd floor, and that alternative was not available to him. He took the first contact in the corridor at close range, and it was brutal and short, and he came out of it with a cut across his left forearm that he felt as heat rather than pain, which was the specific mercy of high adrenaline, and the other 2 men were already on the stairs. He followed them up. He was faster than they expected, which was the one advantage he had, because men who are climbing stairs with a specific objective tend to look up rather than back, and the one who looked back did so about 2 seconds too late. 1 remaining. The 2nd floor landing, corridor to the right. The door Aveline was behind. The man reached it. Sevran was 6 steps behind him. The man tried the door. The door held. Barred from inside. 1 breath of time. Sevran covered the 6 steps. The man turned, and they stood in the corridor of an eastern fortress at the edge of 2 kingdoms in the last seconds before dawn, with everything that had been built and broken and discovered and lost in the last 24 hours converging into the specific, airless weight of a moment that had no version where everyone came through it unchanged. The man was younger than Sevran, broader. He had the specific quality of physical confidence that came from winning most of the engagements he'd been in. And he looked at Sevran with an assessment that lasted less than a second and concluded that this was manageable. That assessment was his last mistake. Sevran moved. What followed happened in the corridor outside a barred door, while the fortress yard below echoed with the sounds of an engagement that was resolving in one direction but had not yet fully resolved, and the cut on Sevran's forearm was making itself known in a more insistent register now. And the man on the floor of the corridor would live, but would not be returning to Brennan's service in any functional capacity. Sevran stood, breathing hard. Finally. The body's credit system demanding payment for everything it had lent at high speed over the last 60 seconds. He turned to the door. "Aveline," he said. A pause. Her voice steady from behind the door. "Is it clear?" "The corridor is clear." Another pause. "The yard?" "Holding." A longer pause. Then the sound of the bar being lifted. The door opened. She stood in the doorway with her back straight and her face carrying the specific expression of someone who has been sitting in a dark room listening to a battle they could not see and have made a decision about how to hold themselves through it. She looked at him. At the blood on his forearm. At the man on the floor. At Sevran's face, which was doing things he was not managing as carefully as usual, because he had just run up a staircase after 2 armed men with a cut on his arm, and management of his own expression was not his current priority. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's minor." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read in the low light. Then she said, "There are more of them, aren't there?" Not a question. He looked at her. He had ridden east with 9 men and crossed into foreign territory and fought his way up a staircase. And the operation that had sent 15 men to a fortress tonight was not the kind of operation that had only 15 men. Brennan had more. And Brennan now knew that his corridor into Velmora was compromised, which meant the timeline he had been working toward had just collapsed, which meant his next move was not strategic patience. It was acceleration. Whatever Brennan had been building toward, whatever the arbitration case was the predicate for, it was going to move faster now. And the one person who had been close enough to the Eastern correspondence to have absorbed, without knowing she absorbed it, the specific sequence of authorizations that would tell someone who understood the protocol exactly how Brennan had constructed his evidentiary base, was standing in a doorway in a Norvac fortress looking at him with dawn coming through the window at the end of the corridor. She was the only person who could reconstruct that sequence from memory, because she had processed every document, because she had been exactly as thorough and discreet as Sevran had described, because she had been paying attention in rooms where powerful men had forgotten she could hear. The thing Brennan needed to suppress, the thing Brennan had moved her to remove from Velmora before she connected what she knew, the thing she didn't yet know she had. Sevran looked at her in the corridor light. He said, "I need to tell you something." And from the courtyard below, Draven's voice cut upward through the dawn air with the specific quality of a command that has found something it didn't expect. "Sevran." One word, the kind that meant, "Come now," the kind that didn't have a version where the news was good. Sevran held Aveline's gaze for 1 second. Then he turned and ran back down the stairs. And what he found in the fortress yard when he reached it stopped him at the entry door with the specific quality of a man who has processed a significant amount of difficult information in the last 12 hours and has just encountered the piece that makes the previous pieces rearrange themselves into a shape that changes everything. Draven stood in the yard. Beside him, restrained between 2 Norvac guards, was a man in travel clothes with the specific quality of someone who had not expected to be caught, who had been moving fast toward the fortress rather than away from it, and who was now looking at Sevran with an expression that was somewhere between calculation and something that might have been relief. The man was one of Hark's riders, the one Sevran had left at the palace. He had ridden through the night. He was carrying a message cylinder, and the seal on the cylinder was not Hark's cipher. It was Lord Brennan's. The message cylinder sat in Sevran's hand and weighed nothing physically and everything else. Brennan's seal. On a cylinder carried by one of Hark's riders, a man who had ridden through the night not away from the palace but toward the fortress, which meant the direction was deliberate, which meant the message was intended to arrive here, which meant Brennan had known where here was before Sevran had fully known himself. He broke the seal. The message was 4 lines. He read them once. He did not read them again. He looked up at Draven, who was watching him with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that the expression on another man's face after reading an unexpected document tells you more than demanding to see the document itself. "What does it say?" Draven said. Sevran handed it to him. Draven read it. His jaw tightened fractionally, the smallest movement barely visible in the early dawn light, but Sevran was watching for it, and it was there. The message said, "The arbitration petition was filed at dawn. The evidentiary package is already in transit to the Southern Compact Authority. Whatever you recover from the palace changes nothing. The case is made. However, there is a conversation available if the King of Velmora prefers resolution over exposure. Lord Brennan will receive him. Alone. The Eastern Way Station. Noon today. 4 lines. The whole shape of it in 4 lines. The filing was already done. The evidence was already moving. Everything Sevran had done since Cassell spoke. The riders, the border crossing, the yard fight, the corridor. None of it had stopped the primary mechanism because the primary mechanism had been designed to move independently of whether the operation inside the palace was discovered. This was what genuine strategic patience looked like from the outside, not the patience of waiting for an opportunity. The patience of building a structure so layered that compromising any individual component did not compromise the outcome, because the outcome had been locked in before the components became visible. Brennan had spent 4 years doing this. He was very good at it. Sevran stood in the gray dawn of a Norvac fortress yard with that knowledge and let it be what it was without flinching from it. Because flinching was a form of lying to yourself, and he was done with lies, including the comfortable ones. Here is what power does to the concept of failure. It makes failure feel like an identity rather than an event. Men who have built empires on the consistent experience of prevailing develop a specific relationship with loss that is not healthy and is rarely examined. They treat every setback as an anomaly to be corrected rather than information to be learned from. They spend enormous energy maintaining the narrative that they are the kind of person things don't go wrong for, because that narrative is foundational to the confidence that keeps the machinery running, and then something goes wrong in a way that can't be corrected. And the choice is between the narrative and the truth. Sevran had been making that choice all night. He was going to keep making it. He looked at Draven. "I'm meeting him." Draven looked at him. "Alone." "That's the condition." "His condition." "Yes." Draven was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of disagreement, the quiet of a man who understands that some decisions belong to the person making them, and commentary is not the same as counsel. "The way station is 4 hours from here," Draven said. "If you leave now, you arrive with margin." "I know the way station." "I'll hold the border open until you're back through." Sevran looked at him. It was not a small thing. Holding a border open, officially, as a stated position rather than a quiet logistical accommodation, was a political statement from a king who had spent 4 years in low-level dispute with the man he was making it for. It was the kind of statement that had downstream implications for the border reorganization, for the Eastern Access conversation, for the specific shape of the relationship between two territories that had been living in calibrated tension. Draven made it without apparent calculation. "Why?" Sevran said. Draven met his gaze directly. "Because someone spent 4 years building a false version of my operation to use against both of us," he said. "And whoever that person is was counting on the fact that you and I would never stand in the same yard long enough to figure that out." A pause. "I don't enjoy being used as someone else's backdrop," Draven said. Sevran held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned toward the stable. He stopped. Avelina was standing at the base of the staircase. She had come down while he was reading the message. She had heard enough. Her face was doing the specific thing it did when she was processing information rapidly and hadn't yet decided which of the things she understood to say out loud. "Brennan," she said. "Yes?" "The arbitration filing. Already done." She absorbed this. Her hands were still at her sides. Not tense, still. The stillness that was a choice rather than an absence. "The Eastern correspondence," she said slowly. "The authorizations, the tariff schedules." She paused. "I processed all of those." "I know. I know what the sequence looked like," she said. "From the inside. I know which documents were adjusted, when and in what order, because I handled the routing for all of it." She paused again, and her eyes moved with the specific quality of a person who is running a catalog in their memory, pulling items and checking them against a pattern she had just been given the key for. "I know which adjustments were genuine tariff management and which ones were manipulated to look like systematic violations." Sevran went very still. "The evidentiary package," she said. "If it's built from the correspondence I handled, I can reconstruct which documents are being presented accurately and which are being misrepresented." She looked at him. "I know what those documents actually said because I wrote the routing notes. I can tell a compact authority the difference between what the documents show and what the actual administrative context was." The specific thing Brennan had needed to suppress, not her knowledge of the operation, her knowledge of the correspondence itself. The administrative context that lived inside a person who had processed every document and written every routing note and understood the actual bureaucratic intention behind authorizations that, stripped of context, looked like systematic violations. Context was the one thing a document pipeline couldn't carry. It lived in the person who had handled the documents. It lived in Aveline. Sevran looked at her. "You understand what that means," he said, "in terms of where you'd have to go and what you'd have to say and in front of whom." "A compact authority proceeding," she said. "Yes, that's not a small thing." I know what it is. You're not obligated, Sevran. Her voice was quiet and final. I spent 3 years doing that work, carefully, accurately, with the specific intention of serving Velmora's Eastern interests because that was the work I was given and I took it seriously. She paused. Someone used that work to build a false case. Someone used my authorization to make me complicit in their cover. She paused again. I'm not going to sit in a Norvac fortress while my work is misrepresented to a compact authority because I was trying to protect myself from embarrassment. He looked at her for a long moment. There are people who do the right thing because they have calculated that it serves their interests. There are people who do the right thing because they have been told to. And there are people who do the right thing in the specific unglamorous way that requires them to walk back into the fire they just walked out of, not because it benefits them, not because anyone will thank them, but because the alternative is allowing something false to stand in the place of something true, and they cannot live with that trade. Aveline was the third kind. She had always been the third kind. He had known that. He had just stopped looking at it directly. Then come, he said. They rode to the way station together, the two of them and 4 of Sevran's remaining riders, and the ride took 4 hours through mountain terrain that was beautiful in the specific indifferent way of places that have watched empires rise and dissolve and will watch the next ones with equal disregard. The pine forest opened periodically onto ridge views where the full scope of the northern range was visible, peak after peak receding into blue distance. The scale of it doing what landscape scale always does, putting the human drama below it in a proportion that is simultaneously humbling and clarifying. They didn't speak much during the ride. What needed to be said had been said or was waiting for the right moment, or was the kind of thing that doesn't benefit from being said on horseback on a mountain road with 4 armed riders in earshot. The silence between them was not the old silence, the comfortable, unexamined silence of 2 people who have stopped fully inhabiting each other's presence. It was a different quality. The silence of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and are still locating their footing on the other side of it. That silence had more honesty in it than most conversations. The Eastern Way Station was a stone structure at a mountain crossroads, built for the practical purpose of providing shelter at the intersection of 3 trade routes. It served the function without ornament, which was consistent with what Sevran knew of Brennan, a man who preferred to operate in locations that appeared administrative rather than political, because administrative locations didn't carry the weight of implication that political ones did. A single horse was tied outside. 1 man. He had come alone as specified, which itself was information. Brennan was confident enough in his legal position to meet without force, which meant he genuinely believed the arbitration filing was sufficient, which meant the meeting was either a negotiation or a performance depending on whether what Sevran brought changed the calculation. They dismounted. Sevran looked at Aveline. She looked back at him. "Ready," she said. Not a question. They went in. Lord Brennan was a man in his 60s who had the quality of someone who had been the most intelligent person in most rooms for most of his life, and had settled into that position with the specific comfort of a man who no longer needed to prove it. He sat at the way station table with a cup of something hot and a document case in front of him, and the expression of a man who has arranged the furniture of a conversation the way he wants it and is waiting for the other parties to take their seats. He looked at Aveline. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not surprise, recalculation. He had not expected her. "Lady Aveline," he said. "Lord Brennan," she said. Her voice was level. She sat across from him without being invited, the same way Drevin had sat in Sevran's study, with the specific authority of someone who has decided that permission is not the operative framework here. Sevran sat beside her. Brennan looked between them. "This is unexpected," he said. "It should be," Sevran said. Brennan was quiet for a moment. He was recalibrating, and he was doing it fast, which was the specific skill of a man who had survived 60 years of high-stakes environments, the ability to absorb an unexpected variable and restructure the conversation around it without losing composure. "The filing stands," Brennan said. "Whatever you've recovered from the palace, whatever confession Drevin or Cassel has produced, the evidentiary package is already in transit. The compact authority will convene within the month." "I know," Sevran said. "Then you understand that this conversation is about terms," Brennan said. not reversal. Tell me the terms, Sevran said. Brennan set his cup down. The Eastern tariff protocols are restructured. Velmora agrees to equal access terms for the Southern Trade Corridor. The three merchant houses I represent receive preferred status in the Northern Treaty renegotiation. He paused. In exchange, the evidentiary package is withdrawn before it reaches the compact authority. The operation inside your palace is treated as an internal administrative matter. No public exposure of Dreven or Castle. He said it with the smooth efficiency of a man who has written this offer in his head many times. Sevran looked at him. Then Sevran looked at Aveline. She was looking at the document case. The routing notes, she said. Brennan looked at her. The evidentiary package, she said. Does it include the original routing notes or only the document copies? A pause. Brennan's expression shifted. A fractional thing, barely perceptible. But Sevran caught it because he was watching for exactly this. The routing notes were part of the transferred correspondence, Brennan said carefully. Which routing notes? Aveline said. The primary channel notes or the secondary cipher notes? Another pause. Longer. Both, Brennan said. But the word arrived half a second later than it should have. Aveline looked at Sevran. He understood. The secondary cipher routing notes were the ones she had written in a shorthand that was specific to her own administrative system, a shorthand she had developed over 2 years of managing Eastern correspondence volume, a shorthand that she had never formally documented because it had never occurred to her that anyone would need to decode it other than her. If the routing notes were in the package and the compact authority tried to read them as standard documentation, they would misread the administrative context at exactly the points where the tariff adjustments had been made. Because the shorthand marked the difference between a permanent policy change and a case-by-case administrative accommodation. Brennan's evidentiary case depended on the accommodations reading as policy. The routing notes, correctly decoded, said they weren't, and Brennan had not known that the woman who wrote them was sitting across from him. Here is the specific kind of reckoning that powerful men rarely face and are therefore rarely prepared for. The moment when the mechanism they built their strategy on turns out to have a person inside it who understands the mechanism better than they do. Not a soldier, not a rival. Someone who is present in the ordinary daily work of an institution, doing the unglamorous labor of administration, developing expertise that accumulated invisibly because no one was watching closely enough to catalog it. Brennan had studied the documents. He had not studied the person who created the document system. That distinction was now the entire case. The routing notes are in your own hands, Sevran said to Aveline. Yes, she said, and I can explain every notation to a compact authority in about 2 hours. She looked at Brennan. The tariff adjustments your case is built on were case-by-case accommodations for specific trade conditions. The secondary cipher notes mark each one with an administrative code that designates temporary variance rather than policy change. She paused. That code looks like a clerical mark to anyone who didn't write it. To me, it's explicit. Brennan sat very still. The specific stillness of a man whose elaborate structure has just revealed a load-bearing wall he didn't know existed. He looked at the document case. He looked at Aveline. He looked at Sevran. And then something happened in his face that was uncommon in men of his position and experience. The specific dissolution of performance. When the performance no longer has an audience, it can persuade. Not defeat exactly. The dropping of a posture that had become too expensive to maintain. You built it around the correspondence, Brennan said finally. Not to Sevran, to Aveline. I built the entire case around documents I assumed no one alive could fully contextualize. I contextualize them every day for 3 years, she said. A long silence. What do you want? Brennan said. To Sevran now. Sevran considered. He thought about what he wanted, which was not the same thing as what he needed, which was not the same thing as what was right. And the discipline of distinguishing between those 3 things in the same moment was what the last 24 hours had been teaching him in the most expensive way available. The evidentiary package is withdrawn, Sevran said. The operation inside my palace goes through formal council review. Not buried, reviewed with full accountability for Dreven and Castle through legitimate channels. He paused. The Eastern tariff protocols will be audited for genuine compact compliance, not restructured to your terms. Audited. If there are real violations, they're addressed through normal trade arbitration, not through a case built on stolen correspondence. Brennan waited. And the merchant houses, Sevran said, get equal access to the Northern Treaty renegotiation, the same equal access every other party gets. Not preferred status. Equal. Brennan looked at him. That's not a significant concession, Brennan said. No, Sevran agreed. It isn't. Because you don't have a case anymore. You have a document package with routing notes that a witness can decode in 2 hours. And you have an operation inside my palace that is going to be fully documented regardless of what we agree here. He paused. What you have from this conversation is the choice between managing an exit with some dignity or managing one without any. The silence in the way station had the quality of a moment that is deciding its own direction. Brennan looked at the document case. He slid it across the table. Take it, he said. Sevran did not move. Aveline picked it up. Brennan stood. He had the bearing of a man recalibrating for the next version of a long game, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. He was not broken by this. He was adjusting. Men who thought in decades rather than campaigns did not break over individual lost campaigns. They adjusted and continued. The audit will find irregularities, Brennan said at the door. Not threatening, factual. It might, Sevran said. If it does, we address them. Brennan looked at him for a moment. You've changed something, Brennan said. Since yesterday. I'm not certain what. He left. The way station held the silence he left behind. Aveline set the document case on the table between them. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Sevran. Then she looked out the single window at the mountain road and the pine forest and the beginning of afternoon light on the western peaks. He's right, she said. The audit will find real irregularities. Probably. You're going to have to deal with them. Yes. Through legitimate channels, which means publicly, which means cost. Yes. She looked at him. You agreed to that before you knew what I had. I agreed to it because it was right, he said. What you had was separate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Why did you come east last night, before you knew about Brennan's men, before you knew about the way station meeting, when you just knew there was a possible threat near the border? She paused. You could have sent Korath. You could have sent a full unit. I know. But you came yourself. Yes. She looked at him with the direct, undeflecting attention that had always been the most distinctive thing about her, the quality of presence that made rooms feel accounted for. I need to know, she said, not for politics, not for what comes next. I need to know if the man who came east last night is who he is going to be, or if he is who he became under pressure for one night. It was the most precise question anyone had asked him in years. He sat with it, because it deserved sitting with. Because answering fast would have been the answer of a man performing rather than thinking, and she would have known the difference, and the difference mattered more than the speed. I don't know the answer to that with certainty, he said. I know that the man who sat in a council room and said what he said about you was not lying about his affection. He was being accurate about his negligence. And I know that negligence at that level, in a person who should know better, is not something you correct by riding east on a dramatic night. He paused. It's something you correct by doing different things in smaller moments over a long time. He paused again. I don't know if I'm capable of that. I know I intend to find out. She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something to the way station's small window, filling it with the specific pale gold of a mountain afternoon. And in that light, her face had the quality of a person who has been through something real and come out on the other side of it in possession of more truth than she started with. That's an honest answer, she said. It's the only one I have. A long pause. She looked at the document case, at the window, back at him. I'm not coming back to what it was, she said. I know. If I come back at all, it's to something different. I know that too. I don't know yet if I'm coming back. I know, he said. You don't have to know today. She looked at him with something that was not quite a decision and not quite its absence. Something in between. The specific location between closed and open where genuine things sometimes begin, if the conditions are honest enough to support them. She picked up the document case and stood. Then let's go home, she said. Not we're going home, not I'm coming home, let's go. The subtle weight of that distinction was not lost on either of them. It was an agreement about direction, not about destination. A choice to move together through the next portion of road without making claims about what the road became afterward. It was enough. It was more than Sevran had expected. They rode west. The palace, when they arrived, was in the controlled state of an institution that has discovered a significant internal problem and is managing it with the specific discipline of people who understand that the management of revelation is as important as the revelation itself. Hark had held the structure together. The council chamber was still sealed. Drevin and Holst and Cassel were still producing their accounts. The northern delegation had been moved to guest quarters with apologies that Sevran would address formally in the morning. The palace had not collapsed. It had bent, hard. Bending was not the same as breaking, and Sevran understood the difference now with a clarity he had not possessed 24 hours ago. He met with Hark for 2 hours that evening, and with his remaining functional council for 1 hour after that, and he gave orders that were different in quality from orders he had given before, not in authority, but in the transparency behind them. He explained his reasoning, not at length, but enough that the men receiving the orders understood the shape of the situation rather than only the instruction. It was a small change. It was not a performance. Then he went to his study. He sat at the north window. The mountain range was dark against a clear evening sky, the peaks outlined in the last light, and he sat with the weight of a day that had rearranged the interior of his understanding in ways that would take a long time to fully inventory. Here is what genuine reckoning costs, and why most men in power avoid it as long as possible. It does not arrive as dramatic revelation. It arrives as quiet, persistent inventory. You sit in the space after the crisis, and you look at the structure of your own choices, and you do not get to select which ones to examine and which to leave in the drawer. Real reckoning is comprehensive. It looks at the full account. Sevran looked at his full account. He was not a good man who had made mistakes. He was a complicated man who had done significant things well and significant things badly, sometimes in the same week, sometimes in the same conversation. He had built real things. He had neglected real people. He had been genuinely capable and genuinely blind in the same body, which was not unusual among human beings, and was not a pardoning of the blindness. What he could do now was not the same as what he had done before. Not because he was a different person, because he had new information about what negligence cost, about what contempt, even comfortable, unconsidered contempt, did to the people on the receiving end of it, about what it felt like to stand in a Norvac fortress at dawn, having crossed a border in the dark and fought up a staircase and still arrived at a moment where the most important thing was not victory. It was the truth he owed to one person who had been paying attention the whole time. He was still at the window when Aveline knocked on his study door. He said, "Come in." She entered. She had changed from her travel clothes, and she looked less like someone who had spent 24 hours in motion, which she had, and more like the version of herself that had always had a quality of composition about her. Not coldness, composition, the specific gathered quality of a person who lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. She crossed the room without preamble and stood beside him at the window. They looked at the mountains together. "Drevin confessed fully," she said. "Hark told me." "Yes." "Will he face the council formally?" "Yes." "And Cassel?" "And Cassel?" She was quiet for a moment. "Brennan." "That's longer," Sevran said. "He operates through layers, but the document case gives us the chain. It will take time." "But it moves." "It moves." She looked at the mountains. "That's enough for tonight." He looked at her, at the profile of her face against the window's last light, at the quality of stillness she carried that he had spent a year not looking at closely and was looking at now. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "Not just the apology, the actual accounting, of what I understood when I understood it, and how long I let the distance grow before I looked at it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said, "but not tonight." He accepted that. They stood at the window while the last light left the peaks and the mountains became shapes rather than details, and the city below the palace settled into its evening sounds, the specific alive murmur of a place that had survived the day and would manage the morning. The empire was not repaired. It was not clean. It had a compromised council and a pending audit and a legal case in motion and a relationship with Norvac that was no longer simply adversarial, which created its own complications. All of that was true. Also true. Two people standing at a window at the end of an impossible day, not performing anything, not managing anything, simply occupying the same space with the specific weight of all that had been said, and not said, and broken, and held, and crossed, and returned to. That was also the shape of things. Power teaches that strength is the capacity to impose your will on circumstances. Most men who hold power for long enough discover that this definition was incomplete. Real strength is not the capacity to impose. It is the capacity to remain present when imposition has run its course, when the armor has earned its cost, when the person across from you has seen the man beneath the crown and has not yet decided what to do with what they've seen, and you are simply there, not performing, not explaining, simply there. That was what Sevran Thorne offered. Not a kingdom, not a throne, not the elaborate machinery of imperial power that he had built over 6 years across 6 territories. His presence, unperformed. It was the most honest thing he had in him. Whether it was enough was not a question the night could answer. Some questions required more than a night. Some questions required the long work of days that arrived without drama. Choices made in smaller moments. The gradual accumulation of a different kind of evidence. Aveline knew that. Sevran was learning it. Outside the north window, the mountain stood in the dark, with the specific patient indifference of things that have watched the full range of what human beings were capable of and remained unchanged by any of it. The empire would continue, repaired where it was broken, honestly audited where it had failed, rebuilt in the places that required different foundations. And in a study above a city that was already asleep, 2 people stood at a window in the last of the light, neither arriving nor departing, simply inhabiting the exact present moment with everything they had left, which was not everything they'd started with and was somehow, improbably, enough to begin. The mountains did not care, but the people standing at the window did, and caring, in the end, was the only empire that mattered.